all, and this is our situation. The Republicans have just finished meeting with the president at the White House. They're either, I think they're on their way back, but coming back on a bus is sort of not like coming back on a, Jaguar. And so they will be here. And John Thune may or may not come. And if he doesn't come, I bless him. And if he does come, I bless him. Because this snowfall, this is what happens when you're in Washington. And then you read about snowfall in the upper Midwest. 1/2 of all the cattle in his state were killed. And that's their business. That's their business. You know, they're not North Dakota. They don't have oil. They're South Dakota. They've got cattle and farming. 1/2. And so, I mean, if he comes back, that's glorious. If he doesn't, then we should all wish him well in that. Losing cattle is they're not people, but they cause people to lose their way of living. You think I should just leave it right there? Head into my statement. You promise not to go to sleep this time, Mark?
Depends which mark you're talking about. I'm always overjoyed and enthusiastic about your opening statement.
Are you? You're probably interested in fisheries, aren't you?
We love fish.
Do you?
And we love crab.
Do you?
Yes.
Would you like the captain too?
I love the captain.
Okay, that's
I just
good.
want to get him back to work.
All right, here we go. In 2008, 2009, this country went through the worst recession since World War II. We will probably never all agree about what or who caused any of this, but we know that the comeback from the Great Recovery has been very slow, and the Great Recession has been very slow and very, very painful. It's odd, actually, to look at the charts, that there continues to be new jobs pumping into the economy, which is the good part, and then you start thinking about all these people that have been laid off, and then all the ripple effect of all of that. So you don't really know where the economy is, but you have the feeling that it's not making much progress. And a lot of people are trying hard on that. So 5 years after that crash, unemployment remains at very high levels, stubbornly. And while our country is finally growing a little bit, it isn't really a whole lot of satisfaction. I think we can say that fairly. Our financial experts and our business leaders are telling us that it's still a fragile recovery. You know, that the economy is still not systemically coming back the way they want. They're saying that if we're not careful with our actions, and nobody's been very careful around here for several months, a misstep could easily slip the economy back into a recession. And if it goes really back into a recession, then that's very, very bad news. Then I think you're talking several years to even begin to have a comeback. So, and I'm just going to be frank about this, a small group of people in Congress have been ignoring these warnings. Why is their business? They have, in my judgment, been recklessly putting our economy at risk of a relapse, which would be a disaster. Last week, they wanted the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. This week, they don't know what they want, but instead of coming to their senses, they're digging in, and that only fixes further pain on our business and family. And that's been one of the problems around here. As they dig in, others dig in on both sides. And you just sort of, even though I would predict that there were some breakthroughs that will be reached, either were reached this morning or will be reached in the next couple of days, the feelings have not declined, and therefore the implications for the future are not necessarily good. Some people seem to think that manufacturing budget crisis is good politics, and I'd be frank about that. I think they've been learning over the past 2 weeks that it's not good politics. And I hope that they're also realizing that it's really bad public policy. If you don't trust my opinion, that this shutdown is hurting our economy. Let me read from a letter that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, which usually write two very different kinds of letters, and 250 other business groups sent to the Congress on September 30th. They said it's not in the best interest of the American employees, or the American people to risk a government shutdown will economically be disruptive and create even more uncertainties for the U.S. economy. Not an enormously interesting statement, but the fact that they both wrote it and sent it and are now sort of putting pressure, more and more pressure on all parties, I think is very important. The damage and the disruption caused by this government shutdown are very, very real. What I regret in this hearing is that we'll be talking about things which come under our jurisdiction. And we won't be discussing things like Head Start and the WIC program and food stamps and everything of that sort. So by not discussing it, all we're recognizing is that we only have jurisdiction over certain things, but within those certain things, there are the same human tragedies that are happening. It's hurting our families under so-called our jurisdiction, our businesses, our government, and our standing in the world. We often talk about the economy in abstract terms, but what we're really talking about is millions of skilled and productive Americans in both the public and the private sectors whose hard work and dedication made our country strong. And all of us who serve on the Commerce Committee understand that economic success is based upon a successful private-public partnership. In this case, I think the private sector will do anything to help, and it's the public sector which is being cantankerous and not particularly helpful. Let me give you a few examples. U.S. aviation manufacturing sector enjoys a worldwide reputation for quality and safety. How do we know their aircraft are safe and reliable? Because the Federal Aviation Administration inspects them. Have you ever seen FAA inspect an airplane? I have. It's terrifying. Nothing is safe. I mean, that's why we have a really safe record. And they certify that they meet high safety standards, and if they don't, they can't take off. Where are our highway, our railroad, and pipeline networks? They're among the safest in the world. It's hard to say when you see all the fracking and natural gas drilling and fires that come out of pipelines that nobody knew were there, to say that, but still, we're pretty good at that. But because experts from the Department of Transportation and the National Transportation Safety Board constantly monitor them, they monitor, but then they study how to make them safer. And when they're doing that, they often have to make new maps because they've uncovered new pipelines which they didn't know were there, simply because pipelines have never really been inspected, and that's why you have to have regulation over things which can have a disastrous effect. So why has the United States led the world for decades in technology and innovation? Because scientists and technical experts at NASA, NSF, DOD, and other federal agencies have performed the basic research and the engineering that private aerospace and technology companies need for commercial purposes. How do we keep dangerous imported products off the store shelves and out of the hands of children? Consumer Product Safety Commission officials monitor our ports, stop dangerous products from entering our stream of commerce. The good captain sitting before us, Keith Colburn, is going to explain to us why NOAA helps the U.S. commercial fishing industry harvest our country's marine resources in a sustainable, responsible way. Perhaps he will also explain to us how his industry relies on something called the Coast Guard, which is part of our work here, to prevent foreign vessels from fishing in our United States waters, which I suspect is now taking place aggressively. For 2 weeks, House Republicans have blocked these government agencies from doing their important jobs. They have told most of our safety experts, scientists, and engineers, go home. And before I conclude, and I apologize for the length of this, if you don't have appropriations, some of the world's most talented professionals are prohibited by law from continuing to help our country. One of the people sitting home this week on furlough without salary is a NIST employee named Dr. David Wineland, who I had never heard of. But the Nobel Prize people have, and they gave him a Nobel Prize in 2012 for his work on atomic physics. Well, he's just sitting at home. Can't go to his lab. Lab closed. The small handful of members of Congress who engineered the government shutdown don't seem to value Dr. Wineland's work as much as the rest of the scientists in this world do. I regret that I had to call this hearing today. And I don't want it to be partisan, but I had to say what was on my mind, okay? This shutdown is doing enormous harm to our country, and it was totally avoidable. It's like black lung. You know what black lung is, Captain? You don't have a lot of that up there. It's where you mine coal and you breathe dust. And when you do autopsies on miners, for the most part, they're going to have black lung. They die from it because they can't breathe. Well, the federal, this isn't our jurisdiction, but the federal MSHA, the federal inspectors who inspect these mines, who operators find expensive to keep safe and therefore, and ventilated and sprayed with water, there are no federal inspectors around, so nobody has to worry. And it scares me in places like West Virginia that do have coal, and other states, what's going to happen. All we needed was a House of Representatives willing to accept reality and the clean CR bill the Senate has sent them. Now, I'm going to end, and I apologize to all of my colleagues. I just want to read this thing. It's very short, and it's terrifying. Consumer Product Safety Commission, 518 of 540 total employees furloughed. Not there. Department of Commerce, 40,000 of 46,000 total employees, not there. Department of Transportation, 18,000 of 55,000, not there. Federal Communications Commission, 1,700 of 1,754, not there. Federal Maritime Commission, 120 of 120 total employees, all of them not there. Federal Trade Commission, 925 of 1,100, not there. NASA, 17,000 of 18,000, not there. 97%. I know, 97%, the distinguished senator tells me. The National Science Foundation, which I cherish, 1,970 of 2,000, not there. So forward, America? Not yet. That concludes my statement, and who shall I call on? Are we in order of arrival? Go to the witnesses? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, you spoke so eloquently for 11 minutes.
This is unprecedented behavior. All right. Well, let me do that then. And we're going to start with the Honorable Deborah A.P. Hersman. I didn't know that what the AP was in there, but I do now. Chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. And the Honorable Marion Blakey, President, Chief Executive Officer, Aerospace Industries Association, former head of the Federal Aviation Administration. Dr. Alan Leshner, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Executive Publisher of Science Magazine. Captain Keith Colburn, Alaska fisherman, owner and operator, F/V Wizard. Am I right? Thank you. And Rachel Weintraub, Legislative Director and Senior Counsel, Consumer Federation of America. Deborah Hersman, may we start with you, please?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, Chairman Rockefeller and members of the committee. I appear before you today to discuss the effect of the federal government shutdown on the mission of the National Transportation Safety Board. On October 1st, 2013, the NTSB delivered furlough notices to 383 of our 405 employees. Our contingency plan for operations following a lapse in appropriations provides that all activities of the NTSB be shut down except for those necessary to prevent imminent threats to the safety of human life or protection of property, consistent with Anti-Deficiency Act requirements and OMB guidance. Here is what we are not doing in the 10 days that have passed since the shutdown. 14 accidents have occurred in which we have not dispatched investigators, including an 8 fatal bus crash that occurred in Tennessee, a 4 fatal general aviation accident that occurred in Arizona, and a worker fatality that occurred just blocks from here on Washington's metro system. In addition to the activities that we are not initiating, the shutdown has resulted in the suspension of work on over 1,000 investigations in all modes of transportation. These delays slow our determination of probable cause and the issuance of safety recommendations, essentially delaying safety to the American public, resulting in lost lives and injuries. As examples, this week we announced the postponement of 2 investigative hearings. The first, a rail hearing involving 2 accidents on Metro North Railroad, and the second, an aviation hearing involving Asiana 214 that had crashed on approach to San Francisco Airport. Both of those hearings have been postponed due to the shutdown. As one of the preeminent safety investigation agencies in the world, we routinely field requests from our domestic and international colleagues to provide technical expertise in their investigations, such as reading flight recorders. In the last 10 days, we have declined 2 international requests for assistance and 1 request from the State Department for support. The NTSB has also received dozens of notifications from our counterparts around the globe about accidents involving U.S. manufactured aircraft. While we are shut down, the NTSB is not able to fully represent U.S. interests in aviation around the world. Here is what the NTSB is doing during the government shutdown. In the last 10 days, we have identified 5 accident investigations that met the legal requirements for accepting employees from furlough. We have also issued 2 sets of urgent safety recommendations identifying imminent threats to life or property. In the event of a major transportation accident that meets the legal criteria for bringing employees back from furlough, we will launch a limited investigative team. Our furloughed employees are prepared to resume their roles as transportation safety investigators to collect perishable evidence and issue urgent safety recommendations only. However, you should know that the investigations would be just that, very limited. We would not provide the other important functions that the public has become accustomed to that do not meet that imminent threat to life or property threshold, such as providing support to accident survivors and victims' families after a crash, or providing updates to the public on the progress of our investigations. The NTSB provides a vital service to the traveling public as the independent voice in conducting detailed accident investigations. I urge you to reopen the government so that the NTSB can fully resume our safety mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Hersman. And now, the Honorable Marianne Blakey, President, Chief Executive Officer, Aerospace Industries Association.
Thank you, Chairman Rockefeller, and thank you, members of the committee, for holding this hearing today. It is a very important topic, and we are very appreciative of your attention on this. Unfortunately, the shutdown is negatively impacting many civil aerospace programs that advance our nation's both technological edge and our economic progress. The longer this goes on, the worse it becomes. While not much attention has been paid so far to the private sector workforce that supports our government agencies, they too are suffering shutdown consequences, especially those smaller companies that are a vital link in the aerospace and defense supply chain. With limited cash flow, they're at risk of shuttering their operations in the event of an extended shutdown. And unlike the Department of Defense, many domestic agencies have furloughed most of their financial and accounting staff, therefore leaving companies that are told they need to perform essential support for government work without payment. In the civil space arena, NASA is operating, just as the chairman said, with a skeleton crew, less than 3% of its 18,000 workers. While industry's work on high-visibility space programs generally so far has been unaffected due to very smart prior planning on the part of industry and NASA, these programs are on borrowed time. If the shutdown drags on, major problems will develop. And additionally, industry's work on many other NASA and commercial programs is already being affected. With a few exceptions, NASA's unique national facilities are shuttered, unavailable for industry access to work either on government or commercial space programs. Support contractors working at NASA locations simply are unable to do their jobs. To compensate, larger companies are encouraging their workers to take unplanned vacations, try to find other assignments. But smaller firms are facing very difficult decisions because they have no assurance that they'll be paid for work done during the shutdown. And of course, the ripple effects are being felt throughout those communities. At the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, reduced staffing is leading to delays in the approval of launch licenses. This is burdening companies that are already risking their own capital to restore America's launch leadership and help NASA become independent of Russia for crew launch. There's also the potential impact to NASA's weather satellite development work they do for NOAA. The Joint Polar Satellite System, JPSS, is scheduled to launch no earlier than 18 months after the end of design life for the Xiaomi satellite that is now up there functioning. The JPSS schedule could worsen if this shutdown extends much longer. Turning to civil aviation, at the FAA, nearly 15,000 employees, about one-third of the workforce, are furloughed. While air traffic controllers are still working, they're doing their job without normal support functions, and they're not able to train or qualify new controllers. A larger impact is being seen in FAA's safety and certification programs. The law requires that FAA certify all aircraft, equipment, training simulators before they can go into service. Although some certification engineers and inspectors are being recalled to work, more than 90% were furloughed when the shutdown began last week. This is delaying the delivery of new products to customers and worsening a backlog that was already affected by the sequester last spring. Also, FAA's Aircraft Registry Office in Oklahoma City is closed, halting delivery of new aircraft to their rightful owners. And regrettably, the FAA has suspended the development, operational testing, and implementation of next-gen technologies, designed, of course, to make our air transportation safer, environmentally better, and efficient. As difficult as the shutdown is, we should not lose sight of sequestration's long-term harm. Federal agencies have dealt with fiscal year 13 sequester by freezing hiring, deferring needed maintenance, eliminating training, and cutting operational travel. These priorities can't be sustained indefinitely. As agencies are forced to choose between today's operating budget and tomorrow's capital investments, there's no doubt investments will suffer. In working to develop a final fiscal year 14 budget, we urge the sequester's replacement be found with more reasonable budget caps. So in conclusion, it's important to stress that the shutdown has only lasted 11 days, and while the impacts I've discussed are tangible and harmful to our nation and our industry, a much lengthier shutdown could lead to cascading, devastating consequences. I believe Congress and the administration must end the shutdown and begin work on a bipartisan grand bargain. Let's ensure our government will not only continue to operate, but that federal programs which advance our nation's economy and our security interests receive the funding they need. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marion Blakey. Dr. Alan Leshner, Chief Executive Officer, American Association of Advancement of Science and the Executive Publisher of Science. That means that when the issue comes out, you've read it all.
Every word.
That's good.
Yeah.
You're an
Just don't
important
ask.
person at our hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to testify before you about the impacts of the government shutdown on the scientific enterprise. And I can say that this shutdown has come as a very serious blow to an already beleaguered American scientific enterprise. The shutdown's affecting both government scientists, many of those supported by federal agencies, and it'll interrupt many long-term studies that depend on continuity over time for their success. Many kinds of data on which the nation depends will be lost or foregone. Our community has already been hit very hard by the sequester, which came as an overlay on federal science budgets that have already declined dramatically just in the past 3 years. These realities are coming at the same time that other countries, many our competitor countries, are dramatically increasing their research and development investments in spite of similar economic conditions. The cumulative effect of these trends, now exacerbated by the shutdown, are threatening America's very standing in the global scientific community. Losing our eminence in science would be a drastic consequence. It likely would result in fewer foreign scientists coming to study and work in the United States, fewer U.S.-based science and technology breakthroughs, and fewer U.S. startup companies and jobs. About the shutdown, unfortunately, the vast majority of federal science staff and programs fall into the so-called non-essential category and are directly affected by the shutdown. I'd like to give you just a few examples. There are more in my written testimony. At the National Institutes of Health, NIH employees that are allowed to continue do provide care for patients in the clinical center, but new patients are generally not being accepted, and normally some 200 patients are entered into trials every day. Moreover, at least 6 new clinical studies have been deferred. The National Science Foundation, this week, NSF announced that it'll be forced to cancel the U.S. Antarctic program's entire upcoming field season if the shutdown continues past October 14th. This could jeopardize the entire research season for hundreds of important projects in astronomy, particle physics, weather, biology, and many of these projects have been many years in development. 3 of 4 U.S. radio telescopes, which are largely funded by NSF, are off the air, impacting several thousands of researchers who can't collect important data. At NASA, scientists have been tracing the shape of the Milky Way using the Very Long Baseline Array, which is now shut down. They're missing an observation, and that means that a year's worth of data could go to waste, and they will have to start over. Much of NOAA's scientific portfolio constitutes what you might think of as environmental intelligence, requiring continuous monitoring and interpretation of an array of scientific parameters. Much of that monitoring will be suspended. For example, effective water management, such as in the Great Lakes, is dependent on understanding water quality issues. That monitoring will be suspended as the relevant NOAA scientists have been furloughed. The same is true for drought managers. In the Department of Energy, most of the national labs, which are managed under contract, would be shielded for a time, but their resources will be short-lived. For example, Sandia Laboratory in New Mexico plans to shut down on October the 21st. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the Y-12 National Security Complex critical component in the nation's nuclear defense enterprise, has already started partial shutdown. What we call extramural researchers, those in our great research universities, are somewhat shielded from the immediate impacts of the shutdown, but the effects will soon reach their labs as grant renewals are disrupted and new grants are delayed in starting. We know that Congress faces many fiscal challenges in the weeks ahead. Let me say the AAAS and the millions of scientists and engineers in academia, small businesses, and large industries that we represent call on you to ensure sustained and robust support for scientific research as you deal with these challenges. I have to say that continuing to decrease the nation's investment in research will only exacerbate our fiscal problems, slowing down the engine of discovery that drives innovation and economic growth. We urge you to help provide a powerful legacy of scientific discovery and innovation for future generations.
Thank you very much, sir. Now it's the Captain Keith Colburn, Alaska fisherman, and owner and operator of the F/V Wizard. You have much to tell us, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Rockefeller, Ranking Member Thune, members of the committee. I appreciate your invitation to appear here today. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for carrying on the legacy of the late Senator Inouye for advancing legislation to combat pirate fishing. I'd also like to thank Senators Begich, Murkowski, Murray, and Cantwell from the Alaska and Washington congressional delegations for their strong support for Alaska fishermen. My name is Keith Colburn, and I'm an Alaska crabber. Some of you may also recognize me as the captain of the fishing vessel Wizard on a Discovery Channel series, The Deadliest Catch. While I'm honored to be before the committee today, I'd rather be 4,000 miles away from here, awaiting the opening of my Bristol Bay red king crab fishery. This is the first time in 28 years that I have not been in the Bering Sea in the month of October. I'm here today on behalf of fishermen. While I'm here to talk specifically about the impacts to my fishery, I want the committee to understand that this shutdown is causing impacts to fisheries nationwide. In the Alaska cod and pollock fisheries, lack of personnel to perform routine administrative functions, such as managing quota allocations, will result in the loss of millions of revenue to that sector of the industry. The Federal Observer Program will also be impacted the longer this shutdown continues. Across the country, vessels that are required to carry federal observers will be forced to stay tied to the docks. Many fishermen and coastal communities are already facing tough times. This unnecessary shutdown may be the tipping point if the situation isn't resolved soon. The Alaska king crab fishery is the model of sustainable fishery management practices. It is managed under a strict quota system where each fisherman is allocated a percentage of the total catch. The Alaska king crab stock is healthy, and with a scientifically based conservative management approach, overfishing does not occur. The fishery results in hundreds of millions in economic activity and provides thousands of jobs for fishermen, processors, and support businesses such as welders, mechanics, shippers, distributors, retailers. I want to be very clear. Bering Sea crab fishermen fund the management costs of the crab fishery through the cost recovery program. We are taxed on our landings to cover management costs. NOAA has money in the bank left over from previous years that could be used to pay for the personnel we need to issue our permits. Despite this fact, NOAA has furloughed the employees that are necessary to start the fishery on the October 15th season opener. We asked the Secretary of Commerce to find the authority and direct NOAA employees to do the task that we've already paid for and issue our crab quotas. The delay in opening of the fishery will have significant impacts on our fishermen and Alaska coastal communities. Collectively, the fleet has already invested millions of dollars out of pocket just gearing up for the season. Each day tied to the docks will cost these boats thousands more. While these short-term impacts are relatively easy to measure, the longer-term market impacts are the scary part. For a majority of our crab, we rely on the holiday market, both in the U.S. and Japan. If the crab isn't caught, processed, and shipped out of Alaska by the second week of November, we stand to lose access to that market. We can't afford to lose any more days to the government shutdown if we want to meet that deadline. Losing the holiday market will decrease the revenue we earn at the dock by 20 to 25%. In the case of the Japanese market, we also stand to lose market share. If the Japanese buyers don't have Alaskan product on hand for the New Year's holiday, they will source their crab from Russia. Market watchers are already noticing uncertainty in the Japanese trade press over the Alaska supply. The Russian king crab fishery is unsustainably managed and subject to a significant amount of pirate fishing. This pirate fishing has already cost the Alaska crab fleet an estimated $500 million since 2000. If this shutdown continues, that amount will only increase. Time is critical. The Wizard is one of many small, family-run businesses that make up the Alaska crab fleet. My wife manages the shoreside end of businesses. My brother's on the boat with me. My crew depends on me to feed their families. We've been racking up bills to get ready to go fishing. If we're tied to the docks, waiting for the government, we can't pay those bills. On behalf of all fishermen, I'm asking Congress to end the shutdown now. I'm a small businessman in a big ocean with big bills, and I need to go fishing. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Captain. And now, Deborah Weintraub.
Good afternoon, Chairman Rockefeller and members of the committee. I'm Rachel Weintraub, Legislative Director and Senior Counsel at Consumer Federation of America. I offer this testimony on behalf of CFA as well as Consumers Union, Consumer Action, the National Consumers League, the National Consumer Law Center on behalf of their low-income clients, Public Citizen, the National Association of Consumer Advocates, and U.S. PIRG. We all expect that the air, food, and products we use every day are going to be safe. We don't expect to be ripped off by a bank or a telemarketer. We expect that we can find information on government websites and that government agencies will investigate concerns and enforce existing law. Part of our security as consumers can be directly linked to the work conducted by the employees of many different government agencies. During the government shutdown, however, many of the consumer protections we depend upon have been significantly curtailed. Things could get worse if the shutdown continues much longer. In this testimony, I am including what I hope to be the most current information available, but the situation is fluid and changes rapidly. I will highlight the impact of the shutdown on a few key agencies. First, the Federal Aviation Administration has furloughed 15,514 of its 46,070 employees. Many of the staffers that support the air traffic controllers have been furloughed, and virtually the entire safety inspection force has been sent home. This is virtually unprecedented. Even during the 1996 shutdown, most safety inspectors remained on the job. Earlier this week, the FAA announced plans to bring back 80,000 inspectors, oversight staff, and others, but that still is only about 15% of the FAA's furloughed safety personnel. At NHTSA, which is responsible for the safety of millions of people on our roads and highways, 333 workers out of a total of 597 have been furloughed. NHTSA is not able to alert consumers about safety recalls, work on rulemakings, and conduct defect investigations, research, and testing. Any auto safety defect that emerges during the shutdown will not be investigated properly, leaving consumers and our highways at risk. The impact of the shutdown on the Consumer Product Safety Commission is significant. 4% of the CPSC's total workforce remains on the job. That's 23 employees out of 540 full-time employees. None of the employees currently working are field investigators or port inspectors, leaving our ports vulnerable, especially problematic during this pre-holiday season. The CPSC, like other agencies, is conducting only business that protects against imminent threats to human safety and protects government property. Rulemakings, recalls, and civil penalty negotiations are suspended unless they rise to that threat. SaferProducts.gov, the CPSC's consumer incident database, is receiving reports but will not be publishing them. Last Monday, a 2-year-old girl in San Diego, California was killed when a television tipped over, crushing her to death. Last week, a 1-year-old boy from Hitterdale, Minnesota, swallowed part of a laundry pod and has been hospitalized due to his injuries. Because of the shutdown, CPSC is unable to investigate these incidents and unable to educate consumers about how to prevent similar tragedies. Food safety is in jeopardy as well. The FDA will not conduct routine food safety inspections. Some compliance and enforcement activities will not be monitored. The CDC is at significantly reduced capacity to identify and respond to foodborne illness outbreaks and is unable to support state and local partners in disease surveillance, which has hampered CDC's capacity to track the recent and current Salmonella outbreak linked to poultry that sickened close to 300 people. While most USDA inspectors of meat and poultry continue to work, the agency has said that a lengthy hiatus would have serious adverse effects. Agencies that seek to ensure fairness in the marketplace are also being compromised. Less than 20% of FTC's employees are exempt from furloughs, no rulemaking will proceed, and staffers overseeing the Do Not Call Registry, the Consumer Response Center, and spam databases are furloughed. The FTC website is not functional. A consumer who is the victim of identity theft cannot access information about the steps they need to take to further protect themselves. Less than 2% of the FCC's staff is working. At the CFTC, which oversees the commodity market and the bulk of derivatives markets, the vast majority of its 700 employees are furloughed, leaving the CFTC with few people to police the markets for fraud and manipulation. The shutdown is jeopardizing numerous consumer protections and placing consumers at potential risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the things that you make me think of is that you were using specific examples, and I think the rest of us have been talking more in sort of the general, the overlay of the situation. And of course, it always comes down to individual science experiments that can't happen. So one of the things that our committee, and before I call on Senator Wicker, our committee has done is to compile, and you all have this in front of you. It's a committee report on government shutdown, and it's 29 pages long. It could be 2,900 pages long, but it gives a closer account, a more human account of what's not happening. And I ask unanimous consent that this report be made a part of the record of this hearing.
Mr. Chairman, this is a report by
Us.
by majority staff of the committee. Is that correct?
Yes, it says majority staffer and on the
That's,
front page.
I just haven't seen it. So no, I have no objection.
Okay, thank you. And I now call on Senator Wicker, who doesn't look like Senator Thune, but is Senator Thune,
Well,
for an opening statement, then we'll go to questions.
let me say on behalf of Senator Thune that because of the unprecedented blizzard in South Dakota, he felt that he needed to get back to his state. And when he heard about this hearing, he tried to make travel arrangements to get back, but has been unable to do so. So I'm sure he would like to have been here. And we wish him a speedy return and wish the people of South Dakota the best during this disaster. Also, as most members know, and most of the public is aware, Republican members of the Senate have been meeting in the White House with President Obama and Vice President Biden for the last 2 hours or more. The meeting lasted longer than people expected, and I guess that's a good thing because we were talking about this very subject. So that's the reason that as ranking member for this hearing, I'm late, and I apologize for that. But thank you, Chairman Rockefeller, for your courtesy, which you've always shown to me and members on this side. No one is happy about the current shutdown. No one.
Senator Wicker, I just wanted to say, I said the things that you said, but I also pointed out, with respect to Senator Thune, that 50% of all of the cattle of South Dakota are dead and buried. Well, they're under snow. And that is a catastrophe, economic catastrophe. And I point out they're not North Dakota. They don't produce oil. They do cattle, you know, agriculture. And so that even his trying to get back here, I think, is a wonderful thing, and I'm proud that you're taking his position.
Well, thank you for saying that, and it is a tragedy and a catastrophe, to be sure. As I said, no one is happy about the current shutdown, nor about any of the shutdowns that have occurred over time. During the Clinton administration, shutdowns cost $1.4 billion, furloughed hundreds of thousands of Americans, and sharply slowed economic growth. This shutdown is likely to be no different, and I think we all hope it ends very soon. The new economic report shows that even a 2-week shutdown would reduce gross domestic product in the fourth quarter by 0.3%. The disagreement arises not over whether the government should be reopened, but rather how we address our country's skyrocketing debt. Achieving reform in a divided government is often difficult, requiring tough decisions and requiring leadership by both political parties. The example set by President Reagan and House Speaker Tip O'Neill 3 decades ago is still relevant today. Despite vast political differences, the two leaders found common ground by putting the best interest of the country first, while still adhering to their long-held principles. In order to end this shutdown, both sides must work together. Both sides can agree there are policies and laws in place today that we would like to see changed. It's my hope that if both sides give a little, both sides will be able to walk away from the negotiating table with something of which they can be proud and we can all be proud. But first, Mr. Chairman, both sides must be willing to sit down at the table and negotiate. And based on news reports and encouraging signs out there in the public, perhaps we are indeed getting closer to a negotiating process. Regrettably, this is a catastrophe of our own creation, and the status quo needs to change. For too long, we have governed crisis to crisis. For the last several years, the Senate has failed to consider appropriation bills under the regular order, instead relying on multiple continuing resolutions or omnibus spending bills to keep government running. A continuing resolution should be a measure of last resort, not taken up lightly for the sake of political expediency. It is not a substitute for comprehensive and open budget process that could help achieve long-term deficit reduction and spur economic growth. According to a recent article in Forbes, in spite of the government shutdown, 87% of government expenditures are still occurring. In other words, after payments for entitlements, interest on the national debt, and, quote, essential personnel and services, only 13% of government expenditures remain subject to this partial government shutdown. No matter how much we cut discretionary spending, it will not be enough to bring our budget deficit or our national debt under control. We must address the main driver of our current financial crisis, namely mandatory entitlement spending. Members of this committee will no doubt agree with today's witnesses that this partial government shutdown is having a negative impact. Beyond that, perhaps we can draw on the experiences of our witnesses in balancing the budgets of their respective organizations, lessons we can heed in getting America on a sustainable fiscal path. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Debbie Hersman, we had a pipeline explosion in West Virginia, and I remember you and a phalanx of people with you coming down and spending a number of days trying to figure out, you know, the layers of pipelines, things which had been pipelined 50 years ago, which weren't on any maps, but the explosion was absolutely devastating. And you were obsessed by it, you were absorbed by it, and you spent a lot of time on it. You flew down. You know, I'm not trying to praise you, I'm just trying to say what you have to do in order to to surmise what the crisis is and how it can be handled. You've mentioned other accidents, Tennessee, et cetera, Minnesota, but can you give us some things that have come across your desk that just flat out frustrate you because there's nothing you can do about it? And if you have so few people left actually on the job, they may not even be the people that you need when you go to a pipeline explosion or some other kind of explosion. They may keep the office running or something. Could you just talk to us about that?
Sure. I think there's certainly the near-term issues of the accidents that we're not picking up, but there's also the longer-term issues of all of the accidents that we've put on hold. And your pipeline accident in Sissonville is one of those. We were working very hard to get that completed before the one-year anniversary, as many other members have accidents that we're working hard to get completed. It is choreographed to try to slot in all of this work. The investigators are handling multiple investigations at the same time, and they work very hard to get that work done to improve the safety of the traveling public. For the years that we've been around, the NTSB has improved the safety of the traveling public. But as far as risks are concerned, if we don't go, we don't know. And so we don't know what some of those risks are that are not being uncovered if we don't launch on those accidents. And I'll tell you, one of the most frustrating things for me watching what's happened over the last 10 days is I have a workforce that wants to get back to work. They work at the NTSB because they believe what they do makes a difference and they improve transportation safety. And they're calling, wanting to know if they can go. And as a leader, that's one of the most difficult things to say to your employees who are committed to the jobs that they do, to tell them that they can't do their job. And that doesn't make any sense.
I thank you. I want to go for one question to Mr. Leshner. I got to find you, Mr. Leshner. I know. Well, I won't for the moment. Rachel, can I go one time? Can I go to you again, because you just clearly are focused and you see all the bottom feeding that other people don't. Now, you see all the human tragedy. We've spent a lot of time in this committee on trying to protect children, all the way from what they see on television, their privacy, all kinds of things. So children, just take children. And the Consumer Product Safety Commission, toys, things of that sort, bring them alive for the committee of what is not going to happen that's good or what could happen that's bad because of the shutdown.
Sure, and of course for children, I mean, some of the things beyond this committee's jurisdiction are having hugely detrimental impacts, especially for low-income children. But in terms of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, there are currently 23 people working at the commission. And there is so much work that gets done every day that they can't do. There are no inspectors at the ports, especially at this time, which is before the holiday season. It is so important to have CPSC inspectors who now have renewed authority and renewed resources as a result of the work of this committee to be at the port, to evaluate whether the products pose choking hazards, whether they contain excessive levels of lead, whether they pose a strangulation risk. Those port inspectors are unable to be at their jobs and do that work. In terms of recalls, only recalls that meet the high bar of an imminent threat to the public or to protect the property of the government are being conducted. We don't know what information we're not finding out. On the saferproducts.gov website, consumers are able to report information, but it's not being updated. So there may be incidents that even the CPSC doesn't know about, that the public certainly doesn't, and they will not find out about those incidents that could affect the safety of their children because the information is not being updated.
I thank you. In order of appearance, we now go to Senator Wicker, if you want to ask a question, then Senator Warner, Nelson, Schatz, Begich, Heinrich, Cantwell. I don't want to depress anybody. But at least you're coming up quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the testimony has been very compelling concerning the negative aspects of this government shutdown. Let me say, Captain Colburn, this is your livelihood, family-run business. This is the way you put groceries on the table and feed your families. You are calling on, in your testimony, you're asking the Secretary of Commerce to direct NOAA employees to fulfill the task that you've already paid to do. You pay this with management. You pay these management costs through the cost recovery program. Is that correct?
That is correct. We
how much do you pay, Captain?
It's a small percentage of our catch, but I know over the last 7 years, I think it's run in millions of dollars for management.
Okay. It may interest the committee to know that there are 3 House members who there are 3 members of Congress, 2 from the House and 1 from the Senate, that agree with your position that the Secretary has the authority to direct NOAA to resume these activities. I hold in my hand a letter signed by Senator Lisa Murkowski, also by Congressman Don Young and Chairman Doc Hastings of the state of Washington. He's chairman of the Committee on Natural Resources. This is a letter that I'm going to ask to be included in the record at this point, Mr. Chairman,
So be it.
to Secretary Penny Pritzker, taking the exact same position that you have taken, that she has the authority under existing law to resume these activities, to get you back to work. And so I would simply say that I agree with you, and with your written and oral testimony that the Secretary has the authority to do this and should do it. Now let me then move on to Ms. Blakey, and this is really a comment to all of you. And I alluded to this in my opening statement. It seems that we have a new normal in the way we do our budgeting. We haven't had a budget for 4 cycles now. The appropriation committees, House and Senate, have different numbers to work with, so we don't get our appropriation bills done. From our standpoint, those on my side of the aisle feel that we don't get amendments, and therefore it takes so much longer to reach unanimous consent agreements to bring these appropriation bills to the floor. And so we don't appropriate money under regular order. When I was first here as a member of the House of Representatives, the Senate passed their appropriation bills, the House passed their appropriation bills. We didn't get them all done, but we had them passed, and we were in conference, and by and large, at least we got half of them done, or a good bit of the budget. So I just would, I would ask you, Ms. Blakey, you mentioned predictability, and you alluded to this in your written statement. Wouldn't you agree that we got back to the basic process of budgeting and the regular appropriation process? This would be helpful to your agency, to the agencies that your organization works with in having predictability.
Absolutely. As you know, Senator Wicker, when I actually had the privilege of working with you, Senator Rockefeller, so many others on this committee, in crafting a viable budget for several of the agencies we work with closely now. Both the FAA and NTSB are the two examples I'm thinking of. But it was vital to come to terms with proposing a budget, understanding the views of both House and Senate. Then you came together on a budget that had both predictability, had clear guidance. We understood the priorities that made sense from the standpoint of congressional concerns, and were able to, throughout the year, act on that. That's a very important thing because it gives clarity in government. I think it gives a clear understanding of what the taxpayers themselves, your constituents, view as being the priorities. And that was the way we used to do business. I certainly now, looking at it from the outside, working with these agencies, would give anything if we could move back to the point where we really actually had appropriations bills passed year after year.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree we need to deal with our fiscal issues on both sides. I would simply remind our colleagues that the Senate passed a budget in the spring and has asked 21 times to go to conference. 21 times to go to conference to have a budget in place. And I got to tell you, I really respect your testimony and your restraint. Because if you're not mad as hell, then I don't think you're appropriately expressing at least the way I feel and a whole lot of folks around the country feel. You know, likely I won't say the company. I got called 2 nights ago by a major company in Virginia. Gentleman who built this company over 25 years, 5,500 employees, does a lot of government contracting. 30% of those employees have been laid off as non-essential. The 70% that have been essential still aren't getting paid because the processors of the checks aren't in place. 25 years of work that this company has built could go down the drain in a couple of weeks because they'll go bankrupt if they don't get their payments. I would ask the issue for the record as well in terms of short-term effects of this idiocy. Threat of default, shutdowns, not majority, not minority, just short-term interest rates in the last few days. What that is doing to every business in America because of the irresponsible actions that are taking place. I would also say one of the incredible ironies is the House has passed, and I know the Senate and whatever final agreement will pass, that our federal workers will get compensated. If we continue this, Captain Colburn didn't get compensated. Your companies aren't going to get compensated. This company isn't going to get fully compensated. The motel owner on Skyline Drive isn't going to get compensated. The remarkable thing is, and the business frustration as somebody who's been a business guy longer than I've been in this job, is that we are going to cost the taxpayer more money because we're going to pay the federal employees, but the starting and stopping, the complete lack of business sense from those who say you can start and stop an enterprise and that doesn't cost more is so divorced from economic reality, it is stunning. We've seen some good signs recently that some may be willing to say, well, maybe America shouldn't default next week. And somehow that's greeted as progress. But what I don't understand is we're going to enter into the negotiations that I think are appropriate, absolutely. Why in the heck would any rational person say and answer Captain Colburn or answer Marion's companies why we should keep the government shut down while we negotiate? And anyone that suggests that let's one off as we read about a tragedy in the press, whether it's around the parks or around our vets or around death benefits, say we got to read about a tragedy before, let's reopen that part. We have to wait for some child to die because the drug wasn't inspected to reopen the FDA? or because somebody got bad flu to reopen USDA, or God forbid, we read about that tragedy in Tennessee last week. Something else happens and because you didn't get your inspectors out. That is not a responsible way to operate an enterprise like the United States government. I mean, it is beyond the pale of comprehension that anyone would say, keep this government shut down because it might give us a little more leverage. Operate on a one-off basis because when we see something in a tragedy, then maybe we'll say, well, that part ought to be reopened. I would ask any who want to keep the government shut, tell us what parts of the government you want to keep shut. Lay out those items. That ought to be, let the American people know what's not an essential. If they're not essential, maybe they should be permanently defunded. But don't do this on a one-off basis. These are just the short-term implications. And I'm not going to get to a question, but Dr. Leshner, you know, we've all heard the term intel inside. I think what we are doing right now is creating a cancer inside of our enterprise. What's happening in the NSF? What young scientist would join or want to apply to go into this field if you don't have any predictability? The rest of the world's not waiting on America to get its act together. They haven't stopped their research. They haven't stopped their innovation while we do this. I would say, you know, we're going to have to do more with less. Again, I've been a business guy longer than I've been in this business, but as a business guy who's led large enterprises, you don't degrade your workforce and drive down the morale when the future means you're going to have to do more with less resources. That is bad business. And I know this is outside the purview of the Commerce Committee, but that is a Commerce Committee's enterprise. It's about business enterprise. That is bad business for our country. And I guess I would only ask those who say, let's one off, let's keep the government shut down while we negotiate ad nauseum. Come tell them to Captain Colburn. Come tell him to Marion Blakely's companies. Come tell him to this 5,500-person company in Virginia is going to get potentially in bankruptcy in 2 weeks. So I appreciate the restraint of the panel. But an awful lot of folks in my state, an awful lot of folks around the country aren't showing that restraint. And it's maybe a little more anger might be warranted at this point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Warner. Senator Nelson.
Well, Senator Warner, in the case of some of the companies affected, I don't appreciate the restraint of the companies, because the restraint of the companies is not putting the real life in front of the small group in the House of Representatives that is causing this shutdown. And let's go back and remember, this shutdown is not about deficits now. This shutdown was about defunding Obamacare. Let's remember how this thing started. And we have seen in living technicolor here today examples all the way from transportation safety to consumer safety, and go down the list, and the captain is losing catch not only by the passage of days, but by foreign predators coming in and taking his catch, as is the case of the loss of catches along the coast of the entire United States. Look at the science projects that are not getting done. Ms. Blakey, I agree with everything that you said. But when I have talked to your CEOs and have asked them, have they gone and talked to the members of Congress who are causing the shutdown? They haven't. Maria Cantwell's company can't deliver Boeings because of the shutdown. you represent a most eminent trade association, aerospace and defense. Ms. Blakey, have you gone and sat down to those members that are voting for this shutdown and explain what is happening in their districts?
The short answer is yes. And I would also point out, not just myself as a trade association executive, but we've had small businesses up here. We, in fact, had a delegation who spent time with leadership, both House and Senate, and literally talking about the effects of this very, very recently. I can't, of course, account for every one of our CEOs' appointments up here on a daily basis, but I can also testify that they are spending a great deal of time making certain that people understand that there are both commercial effects, something that we haven't touched on as much so far in the committee discussion today, but there are competitiveness issues out here. We compete in a global economy in aerospace, and the fact of the matter is that we will very quickly lose credibility, lose standing, lose market share, and this is something that is absolutely critical. So yes, we are up here pointing this out. And I will also tell you, I'm looking forward to a 5 o'clock discussion over at the White House today that the White House has called with us to continue to discuss all of this. So it's a vital dialogue, and I couldn't agree with you more, Senator Nelson, that it has to be with everyone that has a role to play in this.
You do not have to convince the White House. And I'm glad the President has called you, and I assume that one of the things that the President will do is to try to enlist your support to get your executives of these companies, and it's true, the companies have, as a result of them in this shutdown, so many of the people that are being hurt the worst are not the big companies, although their employees that are furloughed are certainly being hurt, but it's those ancillary small companies that live more day to day, paycheck to paycheck, payroll to payroll, that are getting hurt. And I want to encourage you. I met with 2 of your CEOs last week, and they were not ready to step up and go talk to the leadership in the House of Representatives that were allowing this shutdown to continue. And when I said, well, do you think that default is going to have some consequence on your companies? They said, oh, no, we'll get activated with regard to the default. Well, default is in another half a week. It's been a week and a half that we've been in shutdown. So I would implore you all to activate your people. Now, where are the people that are so affected at the Johnson Space Center in Houston? Where are they going to the congressional delegation and talking to them? And I could go through the NASA centers. Everything that you said, I agree with, Ms. Blakey, but you need to put a fire under your executives. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all of the testifiers and just express our gratitude on behalf of the committee for your public service. I know it's difficult to run an enterprise, and it's certainly difficult to be in public service in any situation, but under the sequester, we know it's been terribly difficult, and this is just beyond the pale. In a lot of ways, it's as difficult as it is for folks to be at home. It's very, very challenging for you to be there and not be able to bring your folks back. So we just want to thank you on behalf of the committee. My first question is for Dr. Leshner. I'm concerned, and I think this may be one of the things that Mark Warner has been talking about over a number of weeks and actually years, and that is remaining competitive with respect to the next generation of scientists. And so I'd like you to offer us some insight with respect to the personal, economic, and professional decision-making that a young, promising scientist may be having to go through over the next couple of weeks and months with respect to literally what they do for a living and how that may impact our position with respect to science.
Well, Senator Warner made the point very well that we're already in a position where we're losing our very eminence in science, and therefore our ability to attract the best and brightest to join America's scientific community is getting harder and harder. So as our competitors in Europe and China, where they're investing more and more, though the foreign scientists who came here to work and study are either staying where they are or going to other places. They're seeing the tremendous stress on the American scientific enterprise. Just a statistic to be horrifying, the average age for a first grant at the National Science Foundation now is 37. When I got my PhD, I was able to get my first grant at 25. That means that you can't start an independent scientific career in the United States for 12 years longer than I was able to do it. And those kinds of statistics are a direct result of the difficulty that people are having in getting grants. So if we want to build for the future, if we want to have a scientific enterprise that's the envy of all others in the world, we're going to have to address these kinds of problems directly.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Blakey, I have a question with respect to the airline certification function. Hawaiian Airlines is waiting on its certification so it can provide service to Molokai and Lanai, which is terribly unreliable and overly expensive service. It was delayed as a result of the sequester. And I'd like for you to flesh out exactly how the certification function was disabled under the sequester and what kinds of impacts it's having, not just in Hawaii, but on rural communities in general.
Well, one of the difficulties, of course, that the FAA is struggling with is the fact that their first responsibility is the operational safety of the existing fleet and maintaining that for passengers around the country. So there has had to be some trade-off between new activities, desired new routing, and what is actually possible to do with the cutbacks under sequester, and of course now with the shutdown. And now with the shutdown, I mean, you're talking about out of 1,200 certification personnel, only 200 are functioning right now. Obviously, that doesn't go very far.
And
I don't know the specific, I'm sorry.
What was the backlog before, under sequester? Do you know what the backlog was before we got to this shutdown?
I don't, but it's significant, I can tell you that. And I can certainly look into and see if I can be more helpful on the specifics on the Hawaiian example. But I can also tell you that there is another aspect of this having to do with the licensing and registry of aircraft, because you can't transfer an aircraft unless, in fact, you can register it. And the registry is shut down now. So there was a 36-day backlog before this began, and that was with everybody pedaling very hard, working hard. Now there's no one even opening the mail. And every month, 10,000 aircraft have to be registered or re-registered. So you can start doing the math on this and see where it goes. It's a very, very concerning situation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Begich.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for putting this meeting together. Thanks to all of you being here. You probably get the sense of a little frustration by all of us here, and I know there's both Democrats and Republicans sitting independents at this table, and you're probably as frustrated as we are why you're even here. I mean, I know for you, Captain Keith, you don't want to be on solid ground. You want to be on wavy waters right now. This is unusual for you to be on solid ground in October. And for you to be here is somewhat amazing. But I want to say one thing, Mr. Chairman, and I have some questions for some folks here. You know, we cannot recreate history here. And I hear this word over and over again, we need to get on with negotiations on our budget. No, we did that. We did that starting in July on the continuing resolution. Matter of fact, the Democrats had a number in the Senate and the Republicans in the House had a number. And when all done and said, we agreed with their number, a $70 billion cut to this year's next budget. We agreed with it. We didn't get anything. We agreed with it. So I know there's sometimes revisionist history around this place and amnesia that sets into some people. So when people say we need to negotiate, we have. Now they want another one. Fine. Pick the issue. but we need to open the government up for all the reasons that the captain laid out in his testimony. You know, we had a meeting before he came over here, and it's appalling to me to sit here and have to have you sitting here because you should be back there fishing, taking care of your families, but you're here stuck in the dysfunctional Congress. And for people to say we can't get appropriation bills, I'm missing the picture here, or budget bill, like you brought up, Senator Warner. You know, the budget passed the Senate. The budget passed the House. Now, yes, there are going to be different numbers because that's the process. Then you go to conference committee, which we have tried 21 times to get an agreement to go to conference. 21 times. No one on our side has a problem with it. I'm happy to take whatever amendments they want to throw up and deal with them. But for whatever reason, we can't do it. So let's not have revisionist history in this body anymore. I get it. Now, for all of you that are here, for the captain, my question is very simple. You talked about your impact, but your impact is broader on two parts. And I enjoyed, Marion, your comments too, because you and the captain are very similar. If we fail to produce, market share goes to someone else. They're not waiting around. They're actually looking at us to fail around the world. Russia is looking, they would love to get all our crab business from Japan. They'd love it because it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars over time. So your impact, Captain, is not just you, but it's multifaceted. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, that's fair to say. I'd like to start, though, by mentioning Mr. Wicker's statement earlier, and I want to thank both the House and the Senate for recognizing that my fishery is fee-based. Apparently, maybe I'm making a difference by showing up here today. I'd like to thank Congressman Young and Senator Murkowski and also everybody that's sitting here for putting a Band-Aid on the fisheries. I really appreciate that. But it doesn't. Are we going to get another Band-Aid for allocations? Are we going to get another Band-Aid down the road for the Observer program? At some point, you're going to run out of Band-Aids. And at some point, you're going to need a tourniquet. I mean, I said in my statement to begin with, I'm here on behalf of fishermen. I'm here for crabbers, but I'm here for fishermen. I'm here for our markets to be solid, for our economy to be good, for people to be able to buy my crab. I don't want Russian pirated crab to supplant my crab in the marketplace, not only in Japan, but domestically. I mean, to me, it's crazy right now. I feel like we're putting the Russians to work and we're putting American fishermen out of work. So thank you for the question.
Now that's a very good summary. I bet you, Marion, you could probably say something similar. Well, we have, you know, we compete around the world with our product in the aviation industry, and we're very proud of our product. Because the work you did prior to what you're doing here and what you're doing now, we have some of the best safety records anywhere. And we understand the business. And when it comes to Alaska, there's no other business other than fisheries that we care a lot about, like when you think about it with airlines, because it is our highway in the sky. It moves us from place to place. It ensures that when the captain needs material, he gets it out there, because it's going to come from barge or it's coming from plane. It's that simple. And when you mention the satellite issue, there's not you don't just get to throw up a satellite any time. There's a process. And actually, there's a thing called the orbit. You know, you just don't today say, geez, we're going to go down to, you know, satellite or us and buy a satellite and throw it up in the air. It doesn't work that way. Is that a fair statement?
The commercial satellite industry certainly would echo exactly what you're saying.
I mean, so timing is everything. And the uncertainty creates not just a few $1 million, but can be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, as we found with some systems, as you know, in the last go-around, they didn't fund, and we had to figure out how to fund it. And there's hundreds of millions of dollars cost, because you just can't build these things overnight, and they take a certain amount of time to launch and meet the right orbit and so forth. With the last thing I'll just say, and I'll include some stuff for the record, but, you know, it is very frustrating because it seems to the American people, to Alaskans, this is not complicated. Just sit down and get on with the business. And I think all of you would say that privately, or as we've all said, we wish you were more outraged. I know you are. You're doing very well here, and I appreciate that. But it seems like this should be a simple thing for us to do. Are we going to have differences? Sure. Absolutely. But at the end of the day, we got to solve these problems and not do it on a 3-week, 6-week intervals, because it doesn't, I mean, I can only, like you just said, Captain, there's only so many Band-Aids in the box. And at some point, we're going to put a tourniquet on, and it may not be worth, we may not be able to survive after that. So your comment is actually very clear. Hopefully more people hear it. But I thank you all for being here. It's frustrating to have this meeting, but I thank you all for being here and giving your pitch of what's important about this. But we need your help, and we need your voice, and today you're doing that, so thank you.
Thank you, Senator Begich. Senator Heinrich, to be followed by Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank Senator Begich for the segue to the issue of putting satellites into orbit. We do a lot of work in New Mexico for the rest of the country. But even our private sector entities oftentimes work hand in glove with the public sector, with the Department of Energy, with the Department of Defense. And we literally, at Spaceport America in New Mexico, just had a launch canceled. That's a window that, I mean, we have now missed. If you take a moment and look at what this shutdown means for my state, and I know Dr. Leshner's intimately aware of this because of how much science work we do, but we have 32,000 federal workers out of 2 million residents. Those are just the federal workers that are directly federal workers. We have thousands more at Sandia National Laboratories as contractors. We have thousands more at Los Alamos National Laboratories as contractors. We have 2,000 subcontractors alone at Los Alamos. One retailer said in the paper recently in Los Alamos, anytime the lab sneezes, we catch a cold. That's true in Albuquerque for Sandia National Labs. And that doesn't even begin to touch on the fact that we have Kirtland Air Force Base, Holloman Air Force Base, Cannon Air Force Base, White Sands Missile Range, NASA, Carlsbad Caverns National Park, dozens of parks and monuments, 5 national forests that are unstaffed in the middle of hunting season, millions upon millions of Bureau of Land Management acres that currently can't process energy leases, also unstaffed in the middle of hunting season. So, Mr. Chair, I would ask unanimous consent to include an article I have called New Mexico Amid Shutdown, Economist Warns of Another Recession, and just make the point that I think Dr. Leshner brought up, that our labs are about to shut down, and if they do shut down, even if the rest of the country doesn't slip into a recession, every day that those labs are closed, we get closer to recession in the state of New Mexico.
It will be included.
I was surprised to hear from our colleague that this shutdown is about the debt. And certainly, if we can't get the debt ceiling increased, who knows what's going to happen to our interest rates. And I can guarantee you the only outcome of that will be that we have more debt and higher deficits because of that kind of irresponsible behavior. But as our colleague from Florida brought up, last week it was about Obamacare. It would be easier to negotiate an outcome here if we knew what we were negotiating about. And I think we've got to realize how much damage we are doing to ourselves. And I have one question. It'll be for Dr. Leshner. And I would ask him to step back in time to when he was 25, when he first got that grant, and just give us a sense for somebody who is getting their PhD for the first time, who spent years investing at a university, who's looking out at the rest of their professional career. What kind of a message are we sending to scientists in universities across this country today about whether or not to go to work at the National Radio Observatory, whether or not to go to work at the Department of Energy labs, at NNSA, at National Institutes of Health, or at NASA?
You know, science is a continuous incremental process that has to go on in a continuous way over time. And for a young person to think that their career will be stop, start, will make it extremely difficult to see real accomplishment over time, because science has to be continuous. We have to be continually working on whatever the the problem is, or we lose it. And we certainly, someone made the point, are at risk of losing it to our competitors. Science has gotten more and more global. It's going on all over the world. We collaborate all over the world, but we also, at the same time, have national interest, and we have to maintain that national standing as well.
If you're simply somebody who right now can't acquire data on long-term research because of the shutdown, what that little piece of this, what impact is that going to have on our science over the coming years?
It happens in two ways. One is so there's an interruption and there's a delay. On the other hand, many of those time series studies that have been done are totally dependent on continuity. So if you have a break, you might as well not have done the earlier part, because it's only going to tell you the result as a function of being a continuous process. So although a stall looks like a hiatus, it isn't really a hiatus. Frequently it means, okay, throw away everything you did before, because you won't have that continuous series of measurements.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Senator Cantwell, to be followed by Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really wish that our colleagues on the other side of the dais here would be here. I know you, Senator Wicker was here, and you explained about Senator Thune, but these really are important issues that the impact of this shutdown is having on the American people. And we're hearing in detail about how it's affecting business. And for a minute, I thought I was the only one who woke up this morning with extra angst about this situation. Now, hearing my colleagues on both sides of me, I realize that it's permeating. Because why? Because we're getting real stories fed back to us by constituents, and those constituents are suffering greatly, all because we won't open the government. And I'm almost overwhelmed, Mr. Chairman, on where to go with my questioning, because I have so many questions. I mean, I could ask Ms. Blakely about aviation and the mention in this registry issue she talked about, which means planes can't get delivered, which means customers can't get planes, which means people, you know, and jobs are going to be delayed. The information that I have about the FAA and the fact that the radar system needs to be maintained. If the radar system isn't maintained over time, it has problems and complications. Our own situation with the weather buoys that we have in the Northwest are critical, vital information for us about weather that impacts fisheries. I guess, Captain, you could say, well, we don't have to worry about it because we're shut down, but when they are fishing, it's vital information. But instead of the buoys working and giving the information, last weekend we had a forecast between the Seattle area and Vancouver Island, and we had no idea what was going to happen. And when you're talking about 60 or 70 mile an hour winds, and you're talking about weather forecasts, to have, you can see in this picture, for those of us who were, my colleague from Alaska, familiar with the Pacific Northwest, not understanding whether the storm is going to hit in Seattle and what needs to be done, or whether the storm's going to hit in British Columbia. That's where we were last week. We didn't have the information because there weren't people on the job. And so I look at this situation, and I know my colleague from Mississippi thinks, well, you can just read a few letters and you can say that, you know, that you can call an agency. Well, I can tell you, I've already called about getting these fisheries open. And people have made decisions based on the law and the interpretation of the law. Now, we can disagree with it. I can disagree with it. My colleague here can disagree with it. We can all disagree with the logic of what lawyers have advised. But the bottom line is that's what they have said in a shutdown happens. And so that fishery, as you're saying, the crab fishery, is closed. And so I look, you know what, I just happened to, you had been here, Captain Colburn, a few years ago, and I said, boy, there's so many people on my office team that love you and love that show. Would you sign
They don't work for me, though.
No. Well, that's my point, actually. That is exactly my point. Because you know what, when I was sitting here listening to my colleague from Mississippi tell me that it was all about an amendment, that somebody didn't get an amendment, and I started thinking about that picture, this picture of your vessel, tossing around in the ocean. And if you could see this close up, you can see the ice all over the vessel. You can see the difficulty that this vessel has to operate under, and you have to come back here just to go and do this job and hear somebody talk about how they didn't get an amendment and that's why the government is shut down. It's unbelievable to me that we're sitting here and that you have to come and do this instead of being able to do this job that is already dangerous and treacherous to begin with. And now you have to show up in Washington, D.C., which I think speaks a lot about who you are as a person, because you are for doing the dangerous task and you're coming back here and telling us to get our act together. Now, I want to ask you about this issue because I think some people, again, are under the false impression that, oh, it won't matter and that at some point in time you can just go catch these fish. Like, it won't matter and that if there's some piracy in between now and when the fisheries open, that somehow they'll be caught. And when you mentioned in your testimony this $500 million being lost since 2000, we're talking about an operating Coast Guard. We're talking about people who were helping you. Now, with the difficulty of the shutdown, this impact of piracy and this impact that we're going to roll into loss of business is really going to hurt the fishery if it is not fixed in the next 48 hours, 72 at best. Is that not correct?
We are, even if they do have the creative fix, I think, because it's a fee-based program, get back on track here, we will still be delayed by at least 3 to 4 days on our normal start date. So that is already a given. That's the what if. I mean, we don't know for sure that, you know, you're going to be able to do that. But I'll be honest, I would much rather be up in Alaska right now. I mean, and everybody knows, and they've probably seen that, you know, what I do is really a dangerous job, and can be, you know, at times it can be kind of scary. But I'll be honest, I'm a lot more nervous and scared sitting in this room talking in front of you on this microphone than I ever am when I'm out there in 30-foot seas. But it's even more terrifying when I start hearing about weather systems and weather forecasting getting shut down. You know, a lot of things that impact us out on the ocean, but also that's going to impact people land-based. I mean, the senator from North Dakota with the blizzard that just hit him recently. I mean, where did that blizzard go after that? So ultimately, I'm concerned about the possibility that is very real that we're going to lose our market share to Russian caught crab. They're not going to catch our crab. Our crab's protected, at least right now. Now, if the Coast Guard starts losing more and more funding, well, there's going to be nobody out there to patrol the date line.
And cut back 35%, and they have a very complex set of missions. If there's any organization in the federal government that has been asked to do many, many things with minimal resources, it's the Coast Guard. And so now they're being diminished another 35%. So I think it will be challenging for them if we don't get this government open to continue to focus on the piracy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell and Senator Blumenthal, and then, of course, we'll give all the time we want to Senator Thune and Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to join in thanking the chairman for having this hearing, as well as the staff of the committee for doing such a great job putting together a hearing on such short notice on a problem that I think is obviously vital for us to address. You know, I was listening to one of the shows today as I was buying a cup of coffee, so I caught it out of the corner of my ear and heard about one of the polls that shows that the American people actually have risen in their opinion, favorable opinion, of what the government does, not necessarily of the Congress, which I think understandably has diminished in popularity, but a greater appreciation for what the United States government does and what people who work in the government do, which, of course, is understandable because they are seeing the effects of not having those folks working for them and doing their job, and all of the stuff they take for granted. And of course, we take for granted that when people go into a fast food restaurant, there will be some oversight and investigation of diseases, foodborne diseases that they may find there, and those foodborne diseases don't go on furlough. They take for granted that someone's going to investigate and prosecute the fraudsters and the con artists who victimize them, and of course they don't put any of their employees or themselves on furlough, or the unsafe toys or devices, or the other kinds of things that may be in their home, like a chest of drawers. Ms. Weintraub mentioned that, and those safety issues are not put on hiatus or furlough. So I think there is something very important happening that may be longer lasting, I hope is, among the American public. That is a greater appreciation that these enforcement and other kinds of activities that are undertaken by the government, and the American public, taxpayers, pay for them. So they should understand and appreciate what is done for them. And I want to appreciate, I want to express my appreciation to Captain Colburn for traveling the 4,000 miles and making us aware of one aspect of these effects. But the other point is that I also heard on this same show one of the folks saying, well, you know, Congress doesn't understand the effects on real people. Of course we do. We're hearing it now, but we've also been hearing it literally day after day, hour after hour from our constituents. We are listening to them, and it is really a small, very fractional, fringe group that ideologically is in complete contradiction to the appreciation the American people have for what government does, because they are nihilists and anarchists. They want to shut down government. That's been part of their agenda. And fortunately, I think they have been shown to be wrong, that in their opinion that government is worthless, that it does no good. And I want to thank each of you for coming here today and expressing to us very pointedly and persuasively the harm and hardship that has been done to the sectors of the economy that you represent and the segments of people. Ms. Weintraub, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the specific examples that you've given about individuals, consumers particularly, who are injured as a result of this shutdown.
Sure, and there are many that I can't discuss because I don't know about them because the CPSC hasn't been able to do their work. There were two incidents that I highlighted having to do with product safety and children. The first was the incident of a 2-year-old girl in San Diego, California, who after she took a bath, she went to get clothes out of a chest of drawers, and her family heard a loud crash in their home. And a tragic accident occurred that we've been seeing more and more of.
And she was crushed to death.
Her skull was crushed to death by a large television that was on top of the chest of drawers.
And the agency that's responsible for overseeing the safety of those kinds of devices or equipment that hurt children is the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which is known colloquially as the CSPC.
CPSC, yes.
CPSC, that is one of this alphabet soup of agencies that generally is underappreciated or unappreciated by the American public. And I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for making that point. I know it's in your testimony. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Thune has been kind enough to say that Senator Klobuchar should go next.
Thank you. He's my neighbor to the west. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you. I've worked with nearly all of you, except I haven't been out on your fishing boat. So thank you for your work. And I just had a hearing this morning with Congressman Brady. We both chair the Senate and House sides of the Joint Economic Committee. And one of the witnesses, Mark Zandi, who was an economic advisor to Senator McCain in his campaign, testified about how already, just with this shutdown, we've seen about a 0.5% decrease in domestic product growth. And that he predicts if it goes on for just even a few more weeks will be 1.5% decrease in growth. And when we think about that, I think people automatically think about the furloughed workers and they're not spending money and things like that. But that is really the icing on the cake. What is really the guts of it, from what I've seen, is all of the businesses that are being affected by this and the slowdowns. And I guess I would just, in this week alone, I've had emergency calls from an aircraft manufacturer, Cirrus, in northern Minnesota, very important employer in Duluth, Minnesota. They are 60% exports. They can't ship their planes. They're all at Commerce, where they have to go through this registry department. In Commerce, I think over 80% of the in transportation department, Ms. Blakey, over 80% of those employees are laid off. Mining companies, these are routine permits, not complicated ones, have not been able to get their permits. Companies aren't being able to get approvals for cosmetics and other things. And I love the analogy, because it's what I've been thinking about all week, is that this business isn't static. Other competitors all over the world, just like for your crab, are ready to come in and take over the market. And people have to start thinking of this even beyond the furloughed employees, when it's slowing down American business, just at a time when we're picking up. My state, 5.1% unemployment, because we've been able to pick up the economy. And I guess I'd start on the jet issue. These are planes they make for people in countries all over the world. Ms. Blakey is a former administrator for the FAA. I know you're aware of the FAA registry office that allows companies to make final sales and deliveries of aircraft. Secretary Fox has been trying to work on this, but just because of the rules and the law, as was discussed earlier, he's unable to open that office. Can you discuss the vital role this office plays with commerce across the country?
Absolutely. In fact, I can tell you I'm very pleased to have signed a letter yesterday to Secretary Fox, along with a number of other heads of aviation associations, about how vital it is to get the registry back open, because there is a growing backlog of aircraft that not only are ready for sale, ready for transfer, but at the same time, they have got time-limited funding. The financing for aircraft is usually in place for only a short period of time.
Because they're so expensive.
Well, they do cost a bit. And with that in mind, you don't get long-term loans. And so then if you time out on your financing, you're back at the beginning of things and maybe don't have a deal at all. So there is a tremendous amount at stake on this. And it is new aircraft. I also would remind you that the Congress after 9/11 required that everyone that owns aircraft every 3 years re-register. So you've got a lot of people who have to continue to fly, must register their airplanes, and those are backing up as well. So it is a very serious problem and one that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much. And Secretary Fox has been great about talking to the companies and trying to work on this. But until we open the government, not on a piecemeal basis, because I don't think they were even on the list, so of the various bills that have come through, we have to do this in total. Chairwoman Hersman, I'm well aware of the work that the National Transportation Safety Board does after our bridge collapse, I-35W bridge in the middle of a river on a summer day. How many ongoing investigations or reports on accidents have been curtailed or delayed? And I was just thinking in that bridge collapse to think if there had been a shutdown, so at least we couldn't have tried to figure out what happened so we could prevent it from happening on other bridges, ending in, by the way, us closing down some other bridges in Minnesota so we could fix them. I can't even imagine the effect of that.
We complete about 1,500 investigations every year, so it's safe to say that well over 1,000 have been halted in their tracks. There's very little that we can do to keep those moving, and we really have to establish a very high bar to bring our people back to work, and we've only been able to do that on 5 occasions in the last 10 days for 5 different events. The rest we've had to let go, and I think in many cases we've heard about the delays. I think Safety delayed is safety denied. We don't find these issues, we can't address them.
Okay. Last question, quickly, Ms. Weintraub. Put some questions on the record about some of the very important consumer issues that you've worked on, I've worked on. This is the 10th anniversary of the Do Not Call registry, opened by the FCC and the FTC. However, the registry is currently not operating, and fraud prevention and protection programs are not running during the shutdown. And we already know there's been some issues. There was a hearing on this on the Do Not Call registry and improvements that need to be made. But I can't even imagine what people will think, because they call us all the time when they're bugged by these calls. So what's the status of that?
It is still non-functioning. The FTC's website is actually entirely offline. You go to it, there's a page that says this website is closed. There's critical information on that website. I use an example. If you are the victim of identity theft and you want to find out what to do, and maybe your state consumer protection agency sent you to the FTC to find out what you should do in this circumstance, how do you try to minimize the damage? There's no information available there. And at many different call centers that the FTC administers and other hotlines that are critical to obtaining information from consumers that can help consumers, there are currently not people working there. So the systems are shut down.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm hoping these negotiations and all the time over at the White House the last few days will produce something, but I think we all know the simplest is the Senate bill simply opens the government and that passed the Senate, and we could move on from there. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Ranking Member Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being with us today. We are, I guess we're in the middle of what really should be an avoidable partial government shutdown that nobody wants, but nobody seems willing or able to end. So let's hope that changes quickly. I'm encouraged by some of the discussions that are happening here in the last day or so. But my state of South Dakota, like every state in the country, has felt some of the effects of this. I think that we can't ignore both immediate and the longer-term impacts of having the government shut down, but we also can't ignore the problems that precipitated the current crisis. And one of the reasons we are where we are today is because around here we too often play the short game and not the long game. We end up at the 11th hour grasping to find a solution to try and solve a problem, and everybody's weighing the political impact of how who's going to benefit, who's going to lose. And we really ought to be doing the work earlier in the year and thinking on a more long-term basis. We didn't do appropriation bills this year. We haven't been doing appropriation bills like we normally should. And it seems to me, at least, that as we think about the fact that we've got a $17 trillion debt, we shouldn't get up to where we've got a debt ceiling crisis to talk about that and to figure out what we can be doing to play the long game around here and to do things that are really in the country's long-term interest. And so we're always dealing from crisis to crisis around here, and I think that's an unfortunate way to govern. I know it's the nature of the beast sometimes in this city, and certainly with the Congress and the time that I've been here, and both as a staffer and as a member. But I think we can do much better, and if we did follow regular order, do the budget, do the appropriation bills the way they're supposed to be done, we wouldn't find ourselves in this situation. I just wanted to make one observation, and I know there's been a lot of my colleagues today here have criticized the targeted bills that have been passed by the House of Representatives, and I know that approach isn't ideal, but it's not all that undifferent from the process we follow when the appropriations process is working. And discrete bills are taken up on the floor. And so when we consider areas that have been discussed today, I think it's worth noting that measures passed by the House would fund the food safety mission that the FDA cited in Ms. Weintraub's testimony, the research at NIH cited in Dr. Leshner's testimony, and the FAA's function cited in Ms. Blakey's testimony, as well as many other areas outside the scope of this hearing. And so while all of us want the government to reopen, I would hope that we could acknowledge that there are things that the Senate could do today to mitigate some of the impacts of the shutdown, as we've already done for the military. That was something that everybody kind of found consensus around. And so even though it may not be the ideal way to do things, I think it's important to point out that
There is a CR, it's in the House. There's nothing we can do in the Senate about that until the House takes it up and acts on it. But the House has sent us numerous bills now that fund various portions of the government. And so I guess my question for all of you is, are those bills that have come over here from the House that are funding bills, would they fund the various functions of government and things that you've mentioned here today that are important services that the government provides? Don't all jump at once to answer that question.
No.
Did I get you correctly?
Yes.
You're saying the bill sent by the House would not fund those portions of the government?
It depends on the bill, but I'm not.
NIH?
The NIH was, if I remember correctly, was the clinical center, wasn't the entire agency. Is that correct?
FDA?
I would argue that the piecemeal approach does not adequately protect consumers. In order for consumers to be protected in terms of their the transparency and the fairness in the marketplace, their food, their safety, the air they breathe, the products they use, the cars they drive, the government needs to be fully funded.
Okay, but I'm just saying the programs that the FDA funds, would they or would they not be funded by legislation that's been sent to the Senate from the House?
I believe parts of it would be.
I don't think that's true. I think all of it would be. I think the bills that have come over here have been funding bills that fund at last year's level the functions and services provided by many of the agencies that you all have mentioned here today.
But our system of food safety is actually insured by 3 agencies: the FDC, the CDC, as well as the USDA. And on many issues, it's not just one agency that works on it, but there's agencies that work together and collectively and share information and build on the work of one another.
All right. Well, I will acknowledge that it's you all want to see the full process work. I think we all do. But I think we have to acknowledge that there are, when you come up here and talk about funding deficiencies for specific agencies and programs, there are bills that have come over here that would fund many of those agencies and many of those programs and many of those services. I don't think you can deny that. FEMA, National Guard and Reserve, you can go right down the list. So anyway, obviously that's not a question anybody on the panel wants to answer. I do want to ask one specific question. It has to do with the FAA registry issue that Ms. Blakely, you responded to earlier. There was a letter that was signed by several of our colleagues and a couple on this committee, Mr. Chairman, from both sides of the aisle, basically suggesting that many of those employees, in the last time we went through this in the shutdown, were declared accepted employees because of the important role they play when it comes to public safety and the important role when they play when it comes to national security issues. And so I'm wondering maybe if, as we think about this issue, and I think the letter that was sent points out that the last time this was done differently and that it really does bear heavily on issues of public safety, national security, other important impacts, including the economic impacts that were already mentioned today. But could you elaborate on some of the challenges and some of those economic impacts related to the registry office being closed?
I'd be happy to, because I think that we are definitely of like mind that the registry needs to reopen. I would point out one thing that actually took some digging to determine, because the issue of it wasn't closed back in 95, 96, or 96, 97, whatever the major, but it was this time. The FAA actually had already had an appropriations bill passed, so it was not covered during that shutdown. And that is an important big difference, because there were a number of appropriations bills that actually Congress had passed at that point. That said, the issue that you're raising is a very legitimate one in terms of the importance today. We just signed a letter, a number of us in fact, to Secretary Fox asking that he re-examine the classification or the characterization of the registry as employees that should be seen as accepted. Because as you look at the cumulative effect, the first day, second day, it might be harder to argue that there was immediate safety ramifications. But as this builds up, we believe very strongly that not only do you have genuine safety concerns of not being able to transfer these aircraft, many of new, but some of them are older ones. At the same time, you have big economic impact, the lack of funding that is going to be there, financing is expiring. You have $10,000 a month that you really do need to provide the registrations for. And then there are security issues. The Congress required that the planes, all of them, not just new, but everyone re-register their plane every 3 years so that we would know who is up there. Where's the ownership of these? It's an important issue from Homeland Security's standpoint. So there are a number of ramifications of this that really do argue strongly for opening the registry and trying to then deal with what now is a big backlog of aircraft that need the registry. So again, we'd like very much to see this happen, and we believe it would be possible to re-examine that in light of the growing problems that are there as the shutdown continues. There also were problems because the sequester had already cut back the staff there, and they had a 36-day backlog before this even began. So again, anything that you all can see your way clear to doing on that front, I think the aviation community would very much appreciate it.
Well, hopefully we won't be in this position much longer, but if we are, I hope they'll follow your advice and the advice of some of our colleagues here and declare those people to be accepted, because I do think they have important missions that they perform, and in so many respects that are important to us. So thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thune, very much. And again, I really did sort of bestow upon you a sub-papal blessing for being here. And I know you're in the leadership and that you have to be here in terms of votes, but that sort of half your economy being wiped out is something most people don't experience as a broad body as a state. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. This is a very important hearing. It kind of really makes it pretty clear what's going on. So what is happening is that the Tea Party controls the House of Representatives, and they don't like the government. And so they want to shut it down. And then as people start to complain, they say, well, we'll start to pass bills over here piece by piece to reassemble the government, as people identify how that part of the government helps the American people. And so far, they've already passed 8 or 9 separate bills to send it over to the Senate. They say, oh, the people like the National Institutes of Health. Oh, the people like national parks. Oh, people want to make sure that women and infants are taken care of. People want FEMA to be funded. So piece by piece, they keep sending over bills. So this reminds me of the story of the little boy in Russia, and he hated Kreplach, just hated Kreplach. And his mother one night, she decided, I'm going to show him why he should like Kreplach. And so she takes out the dough, and she starts to make the dough, and she says, just like a pancake. And the boy smiles. Yeah, just like a pancake. I like that. And then she took out the meat, and she chopped up the meat and said, you like meat? Oh, yeah, I love meat. She put that in. Then she baked it up, put it in the soup. She said, you like soup? I like soup. And then she put the Kreplach in the middle of it. And the boy said, Kreplach, I hate Kreplach. I hate it. So what's happening with the Tea Party Republicans is they keep going, the government, I hate it. And now piece by piece, like the Kreplach, we're showing them what the government does. You like the NIH? Oh, I like the NIH. You like national parks? Oh, I like national parks. And piece by piece, as we head towards Christmas, we'll have the whole government reestablished after it had been shut down for 3 months. And once it's put together, the Republican Tea Party House members will go, Kreplach, I hate Kreplach, I hate the government. And so What do we say to people, though, where the Consumer Product Safety Commission has furloughed 96% of its employees right before Christmas? No one is inspecting toys being imported from China that may contain dangerous levels of lead or other life-threatening defects. No one is posting reports to the online consumer product database that I worked to create with this chairman to ensure that the news of deaths of serious injuries are made available to mothers and fathers as an early warning system. No cop is on the beat investigating reports of actual deaths caused by consumer products to ensure that additional lives are not lost. In just the last couple of weeks, an explosion killed a worker in the DC Metro. A bus in Tennessee crossed a median and struck a tractor trailer, killing 8. A plane crashed in Arizona, killing 4. But the cops on the beat at the National Transportation Safety Board aren't investigating any of these incidents. The National Highway Transportation Traffic Administration has furloughed 56% of its employees. More people are killed in highway accidents every day than by tobacco or anything else. Furloughed 56% of their employees. No cop is on the beat to investigate automotive safety defects that could lead to death or serious injury. We are also losing our cops on the Wall Street beat. The Commodities Futures Trading Commission has had to furlough 96% of its staff. Just 28 people are left to monitor a $300 trillion market. How many people are being ripped off all across our country and all across our planet right now? The cops are off the beat. Are there any fewer bad guys right now? No. What keeps them from doing the bad things to good people? The cops on the beat. So yeah, as each day goes by, it's going to be like crepe black. You like pancakes. You like soup. You like meat. You like the Consumer Product Safety Commission. You like the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. And piece by piece, the Republicans will have 8 bills, 20 bills, 30 bills, 50 bills they have to pass as the public comes to understand what's in our government. And so to a certain extent, that's why the polling is so bad for them. The public now sees what the government does. And to a certain extent, they're increasingly understanding that the Affordable Care Act is going to make sure that every poor child in America has health care. So they're saying they're willing to pass a bill to have the NIH get refunded, but still keep the government shut down, unless the Affordable Care Act is repealed or delayed a year, so that poor children can't be covered for coverage. I don't think the public is there. I don't think that's what it's all about. I think what you all have been talking about this afternoon has explained more fully, what it is that we need the government to do. And what is the government, after all? The government is playing a role that individual families can't do for themselves. That's why we have a government. It's the stuff we all decide we have to do together. And thus far, the Tea Party Republicans in the House, they haven't decided yet that the Consumer Product Safety Commission is important enough. But the American people believe it's important. They haven't decided yet that the National Transportation Safety Board or the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration is important. But they will, as each day goes by, when they understand how people's lives are permanently altered because there was no protection. So I thank you so much for everything that you have been doing. And I would ask, Mr. Chairman, that I want to add my concern that this shutdown on top of the sequester is harming American science and our innovation economy very badly. And let's be honest, that's who we are as a country. We are the innovation economy for the planet. That's our business plan. That's what 3% of the world's population does as a business plan for the next generation. And when you're shutting down the NIH, when you're shutting down all these other science-based, innovation-based programs, China and India are just looking at us saying, what are you doing? That's your business plan. That's what we're afraid of. And we don't have to be afraid of them, but we should respect them. They're coming at us in each one of these areas. And that is being shut down in our country. And if it goes on much longer, it just calls into question every young person saying, why should I go into those fields? Why should I spend my life doing that when I can do other things that actually reward me much greater? So I have here, Mr. Chairman, a letter from Dr. Susan Avery, who is the director of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Center, to be included in the record. She notes that the costs associated with a government shutdown far exceed the real or hard documented costs, particularly in the science community, where funding interruptions can have a lasting impact on science experiments, long-term observations, and research personnel. And I would ask, Mr. Chairman, that that letter be included in the record in its entirety.
It's so ordered.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. And may I continue, or?
You may.
Okay, I thank you. Do you all agree, just quickly, do you all agree that the federal government shutdown has increased our risk of serious injury or death because the cops on the beat who are responsible for the early detection of disease, consumer product defects, or dangerous environmental pollution are not at work? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah. Sure, yeah.
Yes?
Yes, sir.
Yes?
I'm actually not in a very good position to judge most of what you laid
fine.
out there.
Okay. I got 4 yeses and they're not in a good position. So we have lost many of the fundamental protections from poisons, defective products, financial crime, because the federal government are being held hostage by an extreme faction. Rachel Weintraub, do you agree that the federal government shutdown has increased the potential for market manipulation in our equities and futures marketplace because the cops on the beat who are supposed to police the markets are not at work?
Yes, I do.
Is it possible that once the financial regulators get back to work, they will never have the time or ability to access and thoroughly analyze the large backlog of data awaiting them to ensure that they identify any wrongdoing and take steps to prosecute?
Yes, especially as the shutdown continues.
Next, just yesterday, the founder of market research firm Nanex noted that the markets have been wilder than any time since August of 2011, and that high-frequency trading is running rampant. Should we be finding a new way to fund the Commodities Futures Trading Commission so that the next time there's a dispute over the budget, we aren't forced to pull our financial cops off the beat?
Yes, this is yet another example of a need for more robust funding for CFTC and for CFTC to be self-funded in the way that other financial regulators are.
And finally, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Weintraub, what are the implications of the Federal Trade Commission, the agency in charge of consumer protection and privacy, of closing its doors for an extended period of time? Is there anyone able to investigate if cyberstalkers target children playing on their parents' iPads?
There is not.
There is not. Crep black. Okay? We just disaggregate the government, and we can see what it's doing on a daily basis to protect every family in our country. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this very important hearing.
Thank you, Senator Markey. I repeat, I'm so glad that you're here. Senator Begich has a question. I think Senator Cantwell may too.
Okay, mine will be very short, but just to be in all fair, because I know it's a tough question that the ranking member asked, because you don't want to get in the crossways of a big issue we're dealing with here, but I want to assist the senator in the answer to his question. For my friend from Alaska, Captain Colburn, Coast Guard wasn't in any of those bills. NOAA wasn't in any of those bills, so your permits and your ability would not be solved by those bills that were sent over from the House. To Ms. Blakey, the satellites weren't in any of those bills. To be in all fairness, the Commerce bill didn't come over. But I want to not put you in the, I'm happy to answer these questions because I think it's a good question, because the assumption is by those bills coming over, magic happens, people get funded. But if I voted for every single one of those piecemeal bills here, you still would not be out in the crabber today. Those satellites would not be up in the air. That's a fact. So I don't know if you have a...
and again, to be fair to Senator Thune, FAA was in those bills, so...
Oh, I agree with that, but as you know where the satellites are, they're in the Commerce bill.
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood.
So under NOAA, which a lot of people don't like NOAA because they don't like some of their other issues, but the fact is half of their budget is satellites.
And
is that fair?
Across the board, yes, it's tremendously important. Across the board, of course, we are also still struggling with the effects of the sequester going into effect in 2014, and that will be also tremendously difficult for all of these agencies. I can testify on the ones such as NOAA, FAA.
Right. We have to kind of jump past this, get the sequester done then. And the last thing, just to while I have you, one of the questions I had was also the other issue with aviation too, besides the register, is the other piece of the equation, which I know in Alaska, as we move into the winter months, schedule changing occurs. You know, when the flights will go or not go, and that takes work with the FAA, and that is not happening now, because as we move out of the summer season, we move into a fall season scheduling plan. Is that also your understanding from many of your members, I know?
I'm not as detailed on that as I would like to be, but certainly one of the difficulties with the air traffic control situation right now is why you have the controllers in terms of day-to-day operational. You don't have all of the work that goes behind them, planning the changes that have to take place. So there's a lot of work that isn't seen necessarily, but is right now.
Is critical.
Critical and not happening.
Very good. And Mr. Chairman, I'll just end on this to my friend from South Dakota. I agree we should have those appropriation bills, but remember, when we do those appropriation bills, actually the government is open. Every time we've done those, the government is open. So I think that's a good point, that, you know, these, in a way, you might call these ones coming over kind of like mini appropriation bills, but usually when you deal with appropriation bills, the government is open.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Blakely, could you comment on the instrument landing system and how that works from in variable weather conditions, and your knowledge about how the FAA works with that? Right now, I'm concerned that the Coast Guard, you know, on their mission, say they have somebody that needs to be rescued, is actually having to fly out on a different path just because they don't have their instrument landing check mark certification by the FAA. Is that something that?
Well, certainly ILS around the country are very important from the standpoint of navigation. You know, it's something that they operate at varying levels of technology, and they do have to be constantly maintained and certified. I don't know the specific on the Coast Guard's need in this regard, but I can certainly try to look into it. As manufacturers, we're not as close to that day in and day out interplay between the requirements of an agency like the Coast Guard and the FAA. This would take me back 5 years plus, but I'd be happy to look into it.
Well, my understanding is that we, from an operational perspective, even though I would consider that preservation of life, the fact that these Coast Guard flights are rescuing people and flying them, if it is on an instrument landing system, then that would be added to your list of these, you know, back-end system issues at FAA that aren't being processed or kept up with, so that you know, you have the Coast Guard having to operate these flights and potentially taking people out, you know, out all sorts of different routes, even though they were supposed to be life-saving flights, just because we don't have that certification during this shutdown. So
they are very short. You're certainly right to focus on the fact that the ongoing certification and maintenance right now, you're down tremendously in terms of the manpower to accomplish those things. And there's going to be a greater and greater backlog and more things that are not going to be able to then be utilized if this goes on a lot longer.
great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, if I might just ask one more, is that okay?
Of course.
And I do not disagree at all that this should be handled in a normal appropriations process. But we didn't do a single bill this year, single appropriation bill. We tried to get one across the floor, won, and didn't pass it. But I guess my point is this, and I understand what you're all saying, that if you can't have everything, you know, then it's not a good outcome. But it strikes me at least, and I would throw this out there as a question. I'm guessing you're probably not going to want to answer this question. But isn't having some funding better than having no funding? Some of the things that have been mentioned, and we're checking. I'm not sure, Mr. Leshner, that the NIH budget wasn't just straightforward funding. I don't think they picked out individual pieces of it. Yeah, I think it was an NIH funding at last year's level. But wouldn't it be better to have that? See, all I'm saying, Mr. Chairman, is, according to the senator from Massachusetts, there are some Tea Party Republicans in the House that don't like some Russian dish. But if the food, yeah, that's, boy, you're dating yourself there. And I get that, but they have a funding bill over there. They have a clean funding bill in the House. They haven't moved it yet. They will, I hope, at some point. I mean, I don't think this can go on forever. Move something at least that can pass, get 218 over there, and the votes necessary there to pass here. But in the meantime, what we can do is do some of the things that they send us, and we have done some things. We did pass legislation that would fund the active duty military. I think we ought to fund the National Guard and Reserve. I offered a unanimous consent request to that effect on the floor, and it was rejected. So all I'm simply saying is, and I guess that's the question, and I heard crickets when I asked it, but isn't it better to have some funding than no funding? Okay, I'll answer that.
I'll answer that.
Yeah.
Not if you're the person that's not getting the funding.
I agree, but I'm saying
if the block is
you've been
riddled with families, and the one family has a great Christmas and everybody else has nothing, that doesn't seem like a very good Christmas.
I'm not talking about the whole enchilada. I'm talking about Ms. Weintraub, Mr. Leschner said that we can't, if we don't get everything, then we can't perform the functions that are required of us or provide the services that are required of us. I'm saying, isn't it better in some of those agencies to get some level of funding to fund some of the things that we can fund rather than none? I mean, I would rather have people back to work, particularly in some of these essential areas, would strike me as be a pretty important priority. And again, there's nothing that we in the Senate here can do today other than encourage our House colleagues to do something with what they have over there in front of them. All we can do is what we can do. And I just think that we have an opportunity, if we should take advantage of it, to fund some of these essential things.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Thune, if I can ask, the problem was, I think, what the captain just said. If we voted for every single one of those, his livelihood is collapsed. We're picking winners and losers when what we should be doing is looking in the totality of government and saying, let's put it back to work, and then let's have these debates. For example, you and I have agreed on some things that we need to curve back in government, but, I think the example that the captain gave was a very interesting one. Here's the street, you 3 win, you 5 don't, because of the priorities the House has set. We've also suggested amending those bills, as you know, and send them back over there. But we have to be careful in who the winners and losers are here when right now, yes, maybe Institute of Health is fully funded. Product safety is not. FAA is. National safety is not. Coast Guard, NOAA is not. So now I look at this table, I see 2.5 winners. And that means the economy, not the government employees that the captain employs, but the private sector people and families that he supports. In an instant, those crabs aren't waiting around twiddling their thumbs, hoping, or their claws, waiting for the shutdown to end. They will move on or die off, just like the cod in about 2 weeks. Same thing. They're not waiting for some magic to happen here, and that means that income never comes back. Never comes back.
I don't disagree with that.
That's my concern.
Well, in reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, again, if we put a bill on the floor, then I would vote for an amendment that you would offer that would fix that particular situation for Captain Colburn that you just mentioned. We are limited to what we can do in the Senate until the House does what it needs to do. All I'm simply saying is that, and the bills that we've sent back to the House have been the identical bills that have already been sent over. We haven't amended them. We've just sent them. We've tried to send them again, the same thing that we've sent them before. That's been the dueling unanimous consent requests that we've had on the floor. So until they take that up and do something with it, the things that they sent us over here, if we pick them up and pass them by unanimous consent like we did the active duty military bill, we restore important functions of the government. And there are certain things that I think are really important that are priorities in my state, priorities in your state, ought to be acknowledged as well. And so I'm not You're
I think
certainly,
that's a good
you're
point.
right in opportunity, and I think you'd find a lot of support for amending those bills.
I would say,
incorporate
Mr.
some
Chairman,
of
just to close, I would say one thing. We did the DOD bill, but because of the rush and the haphazard crisis management around here, guess what we forgot? To pay survivors. So we had to do another rush. So my point is, crisis management from any administration standpoint, I've run businesses, I have been a mayor, is the worst type of policy because you will miss things, just as we did when that bill came over from the House. We all rushed because we wanted to make sure safety in this country was taken care of for our military. We did it, we passed it, we were all excited. Then, oops, we forgot something. I don't want to do that because who's next do we forget? So I'm with you that we should figure out, but my priority is mine. Maria may have a new priority. Jay Rockefeller, are we going to, then we go right back to where? We're just amending.
Well, and we can all amend them. I mean, we've got appropriation bills. We got vehicles on the floor right now, appropriations bills. They're not.
My amendment would be to open up government.
Well, and the senator from Washington could offer that amendment, and it'd probably pass, and it would go back to the House, and until the House picks it up,
Well, let's go.
nothing gets funded. So all I'm saying is, what we can do here in the Senate is all we can do. So,
I'd like to make a statement, and hopefully.
I was waiting for this.
I think the problem with what I think is gimmickry, that is, you got a problem, we'll fix it. It's what the real effect of it, and understandably felt the real effect of it, is to lessen the pressure on the House to do what the House has to do, and which the House doesn't want to do. No, we can't take care of that in the Senate. But by rejecting some of these, see, the government isn't like it's a whole, it's just agencies that don't talk to each other. Government is a vast enterprise which works together. And they have, just like business, government has to feel that the future is going to be stable. So if you kind of, you buy off one group or another group, and that all sounds good, what it really is doing is, to me, is undermining the whole concept of government, a decent government, which you have a hard enough time doing anyway, a decent government acting as a whole for the American people. It's sort of for, by the people who put us here. We have to make the whole government be back in order. We have to fund it all. And that doesn't even get at my vast frustration of sequestration. I think it is an overwhelming sickness. That has to be eliminated. Dr. Leshner is going to have a much thinner magazine to put out when people just start saying, I mean, it's like, you know, people who study to go into be geriatricians in medical school. And what always happens is it's a terrific thing to do because the country is aging very rapidly. But they last about 2 years, and then they switch to a much more well-paying, you know, anesthesiology or something of that sort, because they just, you know, the pay isn't like it should be, and older people are harder to work with, and all that kind of thing. You have to have a holistic effort where everybody is interstitched, if not in every function, at least in their psychology, that we are back as a whole country, a whole government, and that we put down this, what I really think is a hijacking effort by the Tea Party folks. And I was just pointing out to Senator Thune, who I enormously admire, and he knows it, that there's a poll out now that came out this morning, and you know, polls are polls are polls, but this one now indicated that something like 30 to 35% of all Republicans see themselves as Tea Party. They identify themselves as Tea Party. And I don't think either Senator Thune or I believe that, but it's part of what I'm talking about. We are into a generation, or at least a decade, of dividing each other, cutting each other, separating ourselves from each other, not understanding what our common purpose is here. not understanding what it means to get out of bed, really excited to get to work, because instead of having to say, well, boy, the big deal today is going to be a live quorum or some judge that gets voted on. We aren't doing big things. We aren't even approaching that. And I fear also for the institution of governance as a whole. People have lost so much confidence. Of course they've lost confidence in Congress. We're at 5%, we're lucky. But if they lose the confidence in the future, Dr. Leshner, your people have to have confidence in the future, because they're putting down, big debts for long-term efforts. And, they'll get Nobel Prizes. They won't, but they're going to make a heck of a difference. And every one of our folks testifying this morning are part of not just something called the National Transportation Safety Board. They're part of something called the United States government and its responsibilities to the people as a whole. And every one of us are joined in that. We've decided somehow that we have to, because of this phenomenon that's come up, and because of the, I don't know, they get started out with the health care bill, well, we've decided that we're just going to tear each other apart. And you can't cure that by funding 2.5 of 5 people. You cure that by saying we're in this as a whole people, as a whole government, and that we mean to stay that way, so that your scientists and your experts on pipeline explosions and bus this and that, everything else, have a sense of continuity themselves and don't start looking for other jobs. I mean, people don't hang around, and I agree with what you just said that, didn't you, Mark? That people don't hang around waiting for us to sort out our problems. They got to move on. They've got to live, and they're going to find jobs where they can get them, even if they're lesser paying, and they're totally out of what the field of interest is. I don't think any of us can say that we get out of bed every morning just anxious to run to work. I've spent 50 years in public life, starting with the Peace Corps. No, actually just starting with Vista. Peace Corps was before that. Loving every single day because of something called public policy. And why do I love this committee? Because it has really, really smart people on both sides on this committee, and we have an enormous range of responsibilities, some of which are less known to the American people, but all of which are enormously important in affecting families and their livelihoods and their self-esteem. Self-esteem. Our country is losing its self-esteem because of gimmicks and trickery and not facing up to problems. When a country begins to lose its self-esteem, when it begins to separate itself from government as if not their favorite, outlet, something which can be there for them when it's needed without having to think, now I say, is this one funded, is that one funded? It's a whole effort. And it's the opposite of whatever that soup is from Russia that you were talking about. My dear friend, Senator Markey. No, I think we're at a crux, and I think this thing is going to be settled one way or another, and it's going to be political, it's going to be unpleasant. It's past the point where it can be done logically. Now we're sort of each trying to put each other in a position where we can't not do the right thing, depending on your point of view. That's a horrible way to run a country. It's a horrible way to be in Congress. It's a horrible thing to do to the American people. It's a horrible thing. I mean, all I have to do is think of MSHA not inspecting the coal mines in West Virginia. I can stay angry for 3 weeks just saying that. I could say that all day and stay angry, just like Maria gets angry. But I like it when Maria gets angry. But now I'll get off my soapbox here. But I think this is a holistic solution, or it's a catastrophic result for the United States of America. I don't want that. This hearing is adjourned.
identifying imminent threats to life or property. In the event of a major transportation accident that meets the legal criteria for bringing employees back from furlough, we will launch a limited investigative team. Our furloughed employees are prepared to resume their roles as transportation safety investigators to collect perishable evidence and issue urgent safety recommendations only. However, you should know that the investigations would be just that, very limited. We would not provide the other important functions that the public has become accustomed to that do not meet that imminent threat to life or property threshold, such as providing support to accident survivors and victims' families after a crash, or providing updates to the public on the progress of our investigations. The NTSB provides a vital service to the traveling public as the independent voice in conducting detailed accident investigations. I urge you to reopen the government so that the NTSB can fully resume our safety mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Hersman. And now, the Honorable Marianne Blakey, President, Chief Executive Officer, Aerospace Industries Association.
Thank you, Chairman Rockefeller, and thank you, members of the committee, for holding this hearing today. It is a very important topic, and we are very appreciative of your attention on this. Unfortunately, the shutdown is negatively impacting many civil aerospace programs that advance our nation's both technological edge and our economic progress. The longer this goes on, the worse it becomes. While not much attention has been paid so far to the private sector workforce that supports our government agencies, they too are suffering shutdown consequences, especially those smaller companies that are a vital link in the aerospace and defense supply chain. With limited cash flow, they're at risk of shuttering their operations in the event of an extended shutdown. And unlike the Department of Defense, many domestic agencies have furloughed most of their financial and accounting staff, therefore leaving companies that are told they need to perform essential support for government work without payment. In the civil space arena, NASA is operating, just as the chairman said, with a skeleton crew, less than 3% of its 18,000 workers. While industry's work on high visibility space programs generally so far has been unaffected due to very smart prior planning on the part of industry and NASA, these programs are on borrowed time. If the shutdown drags on, major problems will develop. And additionally, industry's work on many other NASA and commercial programs is already being affected. With a few exceptions, NASA's unique national facilities are shuttered, unavailable for industry access to work either on government or commercial space programs. Support contractors working at NASA locations simply are unable to do their jobs. To compensate, larger companies are encouraging their workers to take unplanned vacations, try to find other assignments. But smaller firms are facing very difficult decisions because they have no assurance that they'll be paid for work done during the shutdown. And of course, the ripple effects are being felt throughout those communities. At the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, reduced staffing is leading to delays in the approval of launch licenses. This is burdening companies that are already risking their own capital to restore America's launch leadership and help NASA become independent of Russia for crew launch. There's also the potential impact to NASA's weather satellite development work they do for NOAA. The Joint Polar Satellite System, JPSS, is scheduled to launch no earlier than 18 months after the end of design life for the Xiaomi satellite that is now up there functioning. The JPSS schedule could worsen if this shutdown extends much longer. Turning to civil aviation, at the FAA, nearly 15,000 employees, about one-third of the work.
NASA, NSF, DOD, and other federal agencies have performed the basic research and the engineering that private aerospace and technology companies need for commercial purposes. How do we keep dangerous imported products off the store shelves and out of the hands of children? Consumer Product Safety Commission officials monitor our ports, stop dangerous products from entering our stream of commerce. The good captain sitting before us, Keith Colburn, is going to explain to us why NOAA helps the U.S. commercial fishing industry harvest our country's marine resources in a sustainable, responsible way. Perhaps he will also explain to us how his industry relies on something called the Coast Guard, which is part of our work here, to prevent foreign vessels from fishing in our United States waters, which I suspect is now taking place aggressively. For 2 weeks, House Republicans have blocked these government agencies from doing their important jobs. They have told most of our safety experts, scientists, and engineers, go home. And before I conclude, and I apologize for the length of this, if you don't have appropriations, some of the world's most talented professionals are prohibited by law from continuing to help our country. One of the people sitting home this week on furlough without salary is a NIST employee named Dr. David Wineland, who I had never heard of. But the Nobel Prize people have, and they gave him a Nobel Prize in 2012 for his work on atomic physics. Well, he's just sitting at home. Can't go to his lab. Lab closed. The small handful of members of Congress who engineered the government shutdown don't seem to value Dr. Wineland's work as much as the rest of the scientists in this world do. I regret that I had to call this hearing today. And I don't want it to be partisan, but I had to say what was on my mind, okay? This shutdown is doing enormous harm to our country, and it was totally avoidable. It's like black lung. You know what black lung is, Captain? You don't have a lot of that up there. It's where you mine coal and you breathe dust. And when you do autopsies on miners, for the most part, they're going to have black lung. They die from it because they can't breathe. Well, the federal, this isn't our jurisdiction, but the federal MSHA, the federal inspectors who inspect these mines, who operators find expensive to keep safe and therefore and ventilated and sprayed with water, there are no federal inspectors around, so nobody has to worry. And it scares me in places like West Virginia that do have coal and other states what's going to happen. All we needed was a House of Representatives willing to accept reality and the clean CR bill the Senate has sent them. Now, I'm going to end, and I apologize to all of my colleagues. I just want to read this thing. It's very short, and it's terrifying. Consumer Product Safety Commission, 518 of 540 total employees furloughed. Not there. Department of Commerce, 40,000 of 46,000 total employees, not there. Department of Transportation, 18,000 of 55,000, not there. Federal Communications Commission, 1,700 of 1,754, not there. Federal Maritime Commission, 120 of 120 total employees, all of them not there. Federal Trade Commission, 925 of 1,100, not there. NASA, 17,000 of 18,000, not there. 97%. I know. 97%, the distinguished senator tells me. The National Science Foundation, which I cherish, 1,970 of 2,000, not there. So forward, America? Not yet. That concludes my statement, and who shall I call on? Are we in order of arrival? Go to the witnesses?
Mr. Chairman, you spoke so eloquently for 11 minutes.
This is unprecedented behavior. All right. Well, let me do that then. And we're going to start with the Honorable Deborah A.P. Hersman. I didn't know that what the A.P. was in there, but I do now. Chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. And the Honorable Marion Blakey, President, Chief Executive Officer, Aerospace Industries Association, former head of the Federal Aviation Administration. Dr. Alan Leshner, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Executive Publisher of Science Magazine. Captain Keith Colburn, Alaska fisherman, owner and operator, F/V Wizard. Am I right? Thank you. And Rachel Weintraub, Legislative Director and Senior Counsel, Consumer Federation of America. Deborah Hersman, may we start with you, please?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, Chairman Rockefeller and members of the committee. I appear before you today to discuss the effect of the federal government shutdown on the mission of the National Transportation Safety Board. On October 1st, 2013, the NTSB delivered furlough notices to 383 of our 405 employees. Our contingency plan for operations following a lapse in appropriations provides that all activities of the NTSB be shut down except for those necessary to prevent imminent threats to the safety of human life or protection of property, consistent with Anti-Deficiency Act requirements and OMB guidance. Here is what we are not doing in the 10 days that have passed since the shutdown. 14 accidents have occurred in which we have not dispatched investigators, including an 8 fatal bus crash that occurred in Tennessee, a 4 fatal general aviation accident that occurred in Arizona, and a worker fatality that occurred just blocks from here on Washington's metro system. In addition to the activities that we are not initiating, the shutdown has resulted in the suspension of work on over 1,000 investigations in all modes of transportation. These delays slow our determination of probable cause and the issuance of safety recommendations, essentially delaying safety to the American public, resulting in lost lives and injuries. As examples, this week we announced the postponement of 2 investigative hearings. The first, a rail hearing involving 2 accidents on Metro North Railroad, and the second, an aviation hearing involving Asiana 214 that had crashed on approach to San Francisco Airport. Both of those hearings have been postponed due to the shutdown. As one of the preeminent safety investigation agencies in the world, we routinely field requests from our domestic and international colleagues to provide technical expertise in their investigations, such as reading flight recorders. In the last 10 days, we have declined 2 international requests for assistance and 1 request from the State Department for support. The NTSB has also received dozens of notifications from our counterparts around the globe about accidents involving U.S. manufactured aircraft. While we are shut down, the NTSB is not able to fully represent U.S. interests in aviation around the world. Here is what the NTSB is doing during the government shutdown. In the last 10 days, we have identified 5 accident investigations that met the legal requirements for accepting employees from furlough. We have also issued 2 sets of urgent safety recommendations
all, and this is our situation. The Republicans have just finished meeting with the president at the White House. They're either, I think they're on their way back, but coming back on a bus is sort of not like coming back on a, you know, Jaguar. And so they will be here. And John Thune may or may not come. And if he doesn't come, I bless him. And if he does come, I bless him. Because this snowfall, this is what happens when you're in Washington. And then you read about snowfall in the upper Midwest. 1/2 of all the cattle in his state were killed. And that's their business. That's their business. You know, they're not North Dakota. They don't have oil. They're South Dakota. They've got cattle and farming. 1/2. And so, I mean, if he comes back, that's glorious. If he doesn't, then we should all wish him well in that. Losing cattle is they're not people, but they cause people to lose their way of living. You think I should just leave it right there? Head into my statement. You promise not to go to sleep this time, Mark?
I'm always overjoyed and enthusiastic about your opening statement.
You're probably interested in fisheries, aren't you?
We love fish.
Do you?
And we love crab.
Do you?
Yes.
Would you like the captain too?
I love the captain.
Okay, that's
I just
good.
want to get him back to work.
All right, here we go. In 2008, 2009, this country went through the worst recession since World War II. We will probably never all agree about what or who caused any of this, but we know that the comeback from the Great Recovery has been very slow, and the Great Recession has been very slow and very, very painful. It's odd, actually, to look at the charts, that there continues to be new jobs pumping into the economy, which is the good part, and then you start thinking about all these people that have been laid off, and then all the ripple effect of all of that. So you don't really know where the economy is, but you have the feeling that it's not making much progress. And a lot of people are trying hard on that. So 5 years after that crash, unemployment remains at very high levels, stubbornly. And while our country is finally growing a little bit, it isn't really a whole lot of satisfaction. I think we can say that fairly. Our financial experts and our business leaders are telling us that it's still a fragile recovery. You know, that the economy is still not systemically coming back the way they want. They're saying that if we're not careful with our actions, and nobody's been very careful around here for several months, a misstep could easily slip the economy back into a recession. And if it goes really back into a recession, then that's very, very bad news. Then I think you're talking several years to even begin to have a comeback. So, and I'm just going to be frank about this, a small group of people in Congress have been ignoring these warnings. Why is their business? They have, in my judgment, been recklessly putting our economy at risk of a relapse, which would be a disaster. Last week, they wanted the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. This week, they don't know what they want, but instead of coming to their senses, they're digging in, and that only fixes further pain on our business and family. And that's been one of the problems around here. As they dig in, others dig in on both sides. And you just sort of, even though I would predict that there was some breakthroughs that will be reached, either were reached this morning or will be reached in the next couple of days, the feelings have not declined, and therefore the implications for the future are not necessarily good. Some people seem to think that manufacturing budget crisis is good politics, and I'd be frank about that. I think they have been learning over the past 2 weeks that it's not good politics. And I hope that they're also realizing that it's really bad public policy. If you don't trust my opinion, that this shutdown is hurting our economy. Let me read from a letter that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, which usually write two very different kinds of letters, and 250 other business groups sent to the Congress on September 30th. They said it's not in the best interest of the American employees, or the American people to risk a government shutdown will economically be disruptive and create even more uncertainties for the U.S. economy. Not an enormously interesting statement, but the fact that they both wrote it and sent it and are now sort of putting pressure, more and more pressure on all parties, I think is very important. The damage and the disruption caused by this government shutdown are very, very real. What I regret in this hearing is that we'll be talking about things which come under our jurisdiction. And we won't be discussing things like Head Start and the WIC program and food stamps and everything of that sort. So by not discussing it, all we're recognizing is that we only have jurisdiction over certain things, but within those certain things, there are the same human tragedies that are happening. It's hurting our families under so-called our jurisdiction, our businesses, our government, and our standing in the world. We often talk about the economy in abstract terms, but what we're really talking about is millions of skilled and productive Americans in both the public and the private sectors whose hard work and dedication made our country strong. And all of us who serve on the Commerce Committee understand that economic success is based upon a successful private-public partnership. In this case, I think the private sector will do anything to help, and it's the public sector which is being cantankerous and not particularly helpful. Let me give you a few examples. U.S. aviation manufacturing sector enjoys a worldwide reputation for quality and safety. How do we know their aircraft are safe and reliable? Because the Federal Aviation Administration inspects them. Have you ever seen FAA inspect an airplane? I have. It's terrifying. Nothing is safe. I mean, that's why we have a really safe record. And they certify that they meet high safety standards, and if they don't, they can't take off. Where are our highway, our railroad, and pipeline networks? They're among the safest in the world. It's hard to say when you see all the fracking and natural gas drilling and fires that come out of pipelines that nobody knew were there, to say that, but still, we're pretty good at that. But because experts from the Department of Transportation and the National Transportation Safety Board constantly monitor them, they monitor, but then they study how to make them safer. And when they're doing that, they often have to make new maps because they've uncovered new pipelines which they didn't know were there, simply because pipelines have never really been inspected, and that's why you have to have regulation over things which can have a disastrous effect. So why has the United States led the world for decades in technology and innovation? Because scientists and technical experts